Welcome to the Extremely Boring Stories. Today we listening about how did medieval people exchange without money. If you like our videos, please subscribe our channel and comment where to you watch our videos. You wake before sunrise, not because you want to, but because the day expects something from you. In the medieval world, the morning does not begin with choice. It begins with obligation. The fire must be rekindled. The animals fed. The grain checked for damp. None of these acts involve money, and yet every one of them is part of an exchange system that quietly governs your life. You may never hold a coin today. You may not hold one this week. Possibly not this year. And yet, things will still move. Bread will still be baked. Fields will still be worked. Roofs will still be repaired. Goods and services will pass between hands without any metal changing owners. This is not a world without economy. It is a world with a different kind of economy, one based on memory, custom, pressure, and trust. In much of medieval Europe, coined money existed, but it was scarce, unevenly distributed, and often unreliable. Coins were clipped, debased, hoarded, or simply absent from daily village life. For most ordinary people, peasants, laborers, small craftsmen, money was something other people used. Lords, merchants, cities, the church. Your world functioned on something older and slower. Barter, in its simplest form, sounds easy. You give wheat, you receive shoes. But medieval exchange was rarely that clean. A shoemaker does not need wheat every day. A farmer does not need shoes every week. So exchange became layered, delayed, and remembered. Instead of immediate swaps, most transactions lived in time. You owed someone. Someone owed you. Everyone knew who. Grain was the most common unit of value, not because it was precise, but because it was essential. Grain fed people. Grain fed animals. Grain paid rent. Grain paid priests. Grain was counted, weighed, and argued over endlessly. A bushel of wheat was not just food, it was a promise. If you gave grain to your neighbor today, you were not simply being generous. You were investing in future labor, future help, future goodwill. The understanding was rarely written down. It lived in the shared memory of the village. Memory mattered more than measurement. When a roof collapsed under snow, no coins appeared. Instead, neighbors arrived with tools. Later, those neighbors would expect help with their own harvest. No one kept ledgers, but everyone kept score. This was not kindness. It was survival. The medieval village was small enough that anonymity was impossible. You could not disappear into a crowd. If you failed to return a favor, people remembered. If you broke trust, the punishment was not legal, it was social. Fewer helping hands. Slower responses. Quiet exclusion. Trust was currency. Reputation was wealth. But trust was fragile. Bad harvests disrupted everything. If your grain failed, you had nothing to trade. You still owed labor. You still owed rent. You still owed the church its share. Exchange did not stop just because you were hungry. This is where the system revealed its hardness. Lords often demanded fixed amounts of produce or labor regardless of conditions. If the harvest was poor, the burden became heavier, not lighter. You might owe 3 days of labor a week on the lord's land, plus a portion of your crop, plus seasonal gifts, eggs at Easter, a chicken at Christmas. These were not gifts in the modern sense. They were expected. Custom enforced them more strongly than law. Coins would not help you here even if you had them. What the system wanted was time, strength, and food. Markets did exist. Weekly or seasonal gatherings where goods were exchanged. But even there, barter dominated. Prices fluctuated wildly depending on scarcity, rumor, and need. One year, a pair of boots might cost a small sack of grain. Another year, twice that. There was no fixed price. Only negotiation. You learned quickly who drove a hard bargain and who would soften if pressed. You learned when to trade and when to wait. You learned that waiting too long could mean losing everything. Women played a central role in this economy, though their labor rarely appeared in records. Brewing ale, spinning wool, baking bread, these activities produced trade goods. Ale, especially, functioned as a semi-currency in many villages. It was consumed quickly, but always in demand. A good brewer had power. A poor one lost standing. Nothing was abstract. Everything was physical, heavy, smelling of earth and smoke. Time itself was part of exchange. You might owe labor, at harvest, or after Easter. These phrases carried meaning stronger than dates. They tied obligation to seasons, not calendars. And seasons could betray you. A wet summer could ruin grain. A harsh winter could kill livestock. Exchange systems strained under these pressures. Debts accumulated. Promises stretched thin. In extreme cases, trust collapsed. People fled. Villages emptied. Lords tightened control. Exchange became coercion. Yet most of the time, the system held, not because it was fair, but because it was necessary. You did not need coins to know what you owed. You felt it in your body. In the ache of your hands. In the weight of the sack you carried to someone else's door. This was an economy you lived inside, not one you observed. And as long as memory held, as long as people remembered who had helped whom, the system worked. After a while, you begin to notice that the system no longer feels light. What once felt like mutual support now presses on you like a weight that never fully lifts. Promises made years ago are still remembered. Favors given long ago are still counted. In a world without written contracts, memory stretches across seasons, and sometimes across generations. This is where the quiet strain begins. When your father helped repair a neighbor's fence 20 years ago, that act did not disappear. It lingered. When your mother lent grain during a harsh winter, that grain became a thread binding two households together. And now, as you stand in their place, those threads pull on you. You inherit obligations you did not choose. In many medieval villages, exchange was not reset with death. If your family owed labor or produce, that debt passed to you. It was not called debt in the modern sense, but it functioned like one. Custom remembered what individuals could not. This inheritance of obligation created stability, but also resentment. You might find yourself working extra days on a lord's land because your grandfather once accepted protection during a famine. You might owe a share of your harvest because a distant relative borrowed seed decades earlier. There was no ledger to consult, no way to dispute the details. The truth lived in collective agreement, not evidence. And collective agreement was not always kind. As populations grew in the High Middle Ages, villages expanded. New families arrived. Old memories blurred. The exchange system struggled to adapt. Trust worked best when everyone knew everyone else. Once that familiarity weakened, suspicion crept in. Strangers disrupted the balance. Newcomers often had to prove themselves through years of reliability before being fully trusted. Until then, they were excluded from certain exchanges. They paid more. They received less. Reputation took time to build, and until it did, life was harder. At the same time, lords began to formalize obligations. What had once been flexible, help at harvest, a portion of grain, became fixed. 3 days of labor per week. A specific measure of wheat. A set number of hens per year. This shift reduced uncertainty for those in power but increased pressure on those below. Flexibility disappeared. If the harvest failed, obligations did not shrink. If illness struck, labor was still expected. Exchange turned from mutual reliance into enforced extraction. This was still not money, but it behaved like a tax. Written records slowly entered the scene. Tallies carved into wood. Lists kept by stewards. Marks scratched into parchment. These records were not neutral. They favored those who wrote them. Once obligation was written, it hardened. A spoken promise could be renegotiated. A written one could not. You begin to feel the difference. Where once you could explain your hardship, now you are told the record says otherwise. Where once exchange relied on understanding, now it relies on enforcement. Markets grew alongside this shift. As towns expanded, coin became more common. But instead of replacing old systems, money layered over them. You still owed labor. You still paid rent in grain. Now you might also owe cash, for access to mills, ovens, or bridges. Money did not simplify life. It complicated it. You might have grain but no coins. You might be rich in labor but poor in cash. The system did not care. Obligations multiplied. The village memory that once protected you now trapped you. Everyone knew your family's history. Everyone knew what you owed. There was no escape except distance. Some people left. They drifted toward towns, hoping anonymity would free them. In cities, money mattered more than memory. A coin could erase obligation. But city life brought its own risks: crowding, disease, unstable work. For those who stayed, adaptation was the only option. People learned to negotiate more carefully, to limit promises, to avoid borrowing unless desperate. Exchange became cautious rather than generous. Trust narrowed. Women, again, carried much of this burden quietly. Household management became a form of economic strategy. Stretching grain, choosing when to give and when to withhold, deciding which relationships to maintain. A wrong choice could isolate a family. Religious institutions inserted themselves into this fragile balance. The Church framed exchange in moral terms: charity, sin, obligation to God. Tithes were demanded regardless of personal circumstances. Refusal risked spiritual consequences, not just social ones. Exchange now carried moral weight. To fail was not just impractical, it was sinful. Yet despite all this pressure, the system endured. Not because it was efficient, but because alternatives were limited. Coin shortages persisted. Transportation was slow. Central authority weak. Local systems, however strained, were still functional. But cracks were widening. When memory became burden rather than bond, when obligation outlived fairness, when trust hardened into control, the old exchange system began to lose its humanity. You rarely forget the first time you owe bread. Not the abstract idea of it, but the physical memory. The moment when you accept a loaf that is not yours, knowing it carries a future obligation. The crust is still warm. The smell fills the room. Hunger makes the decision easy. Consequences come later. In the medieval world, bread was not just food. It was time made solid. It represented hours of labor in the field, days of drying and grinding grain, the careful tending of fire. To owe bread was to owe someone else's effort, their survival margin, their security against winter. This kind of debt did not end when the loaf was eaten. In villages where coins were scarce and unreliable, bread functioned as one of the most common units of remembered exchange. Not because it lasted, but because everyone understood its value. You could not pretend it meant nothing. You could not exaggerate its worth. Bread was honest. And because it was honest, it was powerful. When a family ran short, after a bad harvest, illness, or unexpected visitors, it was often bread they borrowed first. Not grain. Grain could still be planted. Bread meant immediate need. The person who gave it knew this. They did not expect repayment tomorrow, or even next week. What they expected was memory. Bread debts were rarely spoken aloud after the moment of giving. There was no receipt, no record, but the act was noted, quietly, by both sides. It entered the shared mental ledger of the village. You remember who fed you when you were weak. And they remember too. This kind of debt shaped relationships in subtle ways. A household that owed bread might feel a constant, low pressure to comply with requests later, help with harvest, lending tools, caring for animals, supporting disputes. Refusal became difficult. After all, bread had once crossed the threshold. These debts were not enforced by law. They were enforced by expectation. And expectation could be heavier than punishment. In good years, bread debts faded into the background. A return loaf here, an extra day of labor there. Things balanced out. But in bad years, memory sharpened. During famine, bread debts multiplied. Grain stores ran low. Fields failed. Weather turned hostile. In these moments, bread became dangerous to give. Each loaf offered was a risk. Would it ever come back? Would the giver themselves starve later? This created moral tension. Church teachings encouraged charity. Villages depended on mutual aid. But survival was not evenly distributed. Some families had more reserves. Others lived season to season. Those with more were expected to share. Refusal carried consequences, not legal ones, but social and spiritual. To deny bread was to mark yourself. But to give too much was to endanger your own household. So people gave cautiously, half loaves, old bread, promises of future baking rather than immediate help. Exchange became fragmented. Bread began to carry not just value, but judgment. Women were often the ones who decided these exchanges. They controlled ovens, managed grain, portioned meals. A decision to give bread was often theirs, and the consequences followed them. A woman known to give freely earned respect and requests. One known to refuse gained a different reputation. Neither was safe. Children learned these rules early. They were taught where they could eat and where they could not. Accepting food carried obligation. Even children understood that a shared crust meant future expectation. This was not generosity in the modern sense. It was embedded survival logic. Bread also functioned as delayed payment. A laborer might work a day in exchange for meals rather than goods. Payment came in bread eaten during the work itself. Once eaten, it could not be reclaimed, but memory ensured the labor was considered settled. This made bread a tool of control. Lords sometimes paid workers in food rather than coin. It saved money and maintained dependence. You ate because they allowed it. Hunger could be managed. The same applied in monasteries. Monastic communities often fed laborers, pilgrims, and the poor. Bread was distributed daily, but this was not unconditional. It reinforced hierarchy and obedience. Bread was mercy, but also power. In towns, bakeries complicated things. Bread could be purchased, yes, but also extended on credit. A baker might allow a family to run a tab, knowing repayment would come after harvest. This credit system relied heavily on trust and reputation. Defaulting carried consequences. A family that failed to repay a baker might find themselves quietly refused service later. No confrontation, just closed doors. Bread denied without explanation. Because bread could not be hoarded easily, it forced constant interaction. Grain could be stored. Bread had to be renewed. This renewal cycle reinforced memory. Every loaf reminded you of past exchanges. You did not escape debt by waiting. Time did not erase bread owed. It only layered it. In some regions, bread debts became formalized. Tallies were kept. Notched sticks recorded loaves given and returned. These tallies were simple but binding. They reduced ambiguity, but also flexibility. Once written, memory hardened. Now there was proof. This shift marked a turning point. Bread, once governed by shared understanding, began to enter systems of record. What had been human became administrative. And administration rarely forgets. By the late medieval period, as towns expanded and markets grew, bread remained central, but its role changed. It moved from memory-based exchange toward regulated commodity. Prices fixed. Weights standardized. Debts monetized. But in villages, memory lingered longer. Old people could still recall who fed whom decades earlier. Stories of bread given during hard winters became part of family identity. Gratitude passed down. So did resentment. Some debts were never repaid, not because people refused, but because life ended before balance was restored. Those debts did not vanish. They became stories. Stories shaped behavior, shaped alliances, shaped silence. Bread was eaten, digested, forgotten by the body, but remembered by the community. What began as a single loaf during a hard week slowly stretches itself across years. It follows you quietly, shaping how others speak to you, what they expect from you, and how much freedom you truly have. You are no longer just a neighbor. You are someone who once needed help, and that fact does not fade easily. In theory, bread debts were equal. A loaf given should be a loaf returned. But in practice, equality rarely existed. Some households were always closer to hunger than others. They borrowed more often. They repaid more slowly. Over time, these families developed reputations, not always fair ones. They always need help. They never quite settle what they owe. These judgments were rarely spoken directly, but they influenced everything. A family marked this way found fewer open doors. The exchange system, built on memory, began to sort people into quiet categories: reliable, risky, generous, needy. Once placed, it was hard to move. This is where bread stopped being just food and became leverage. If you owed bread, you were more likely to agree when asked for help. You worked longer hours. You accepted poorer terms. You stayed silent during disputes. Bread debt softened your resistance. It made refusal feel immoral. And everyone knew it. This dynamic became especially visible during communal labor, harvests, repairs, construction. Those who owed bread were expected to show up first and stay longest. If they did not, the memory of bread resurfaced quickly. You remember when? That phrase carried power. In times of conflict, bread debts could be weaponized. Arguments over land boundaries, animals, or inheritance often dragged old food exchanges into the open. Someone might remind the village how often they had fed another family. The implication was clear: gratitude should look like obedience. This was not written law. It was moral pressure. For widows and the elderly, bread debt was especially dangerous. Without strong labor power, repayment depended on future goodwill. Accepting bread could trap them in long-term dependence. Refusing it could mean starvation. There was no good choice. Religious institutions intensified this tension. Churches and monasteries distributed bread as charity, especially during famine. But charity was never neutral. It reinforced hierarchy. Those who received bread were reminded, gently but clearly, of their spiritual and social position. Bread given by the church came with sermons about humility and obedience. It was help, but it was also instruction. Some monasteries kept careful records of bread distribution. Names, dates, amounts. These lists were meant to ensure fairness, but they also created permanent memory. A family marked as frequent recipients could not easily escape that label. Bread debt, once written, became identity. In towns, this logic spread through bakeries. Bakers extended credit not out of kindness, but necessity. People needed bread daily. Coin was irregular. Credit bridged the gap. But credit required trust. If you missed repayment, even once, your name might be quietly shared among bakers. Not formally banned, just avoided. You would find excuses instead of bread. No flour today. Oven broken. Come back tomorrow. Tomorrow often never came. This soft exclusion was devastating. Without bread, life collapsed quickly. People resorted to begging, theft, or migration. Bread debt, unresolved, could push someone out of the community entirely. At the same time, those who controlled bread gained influence. Bakers, landowners with large ovens, monasteries with grain stores. Their ability to feed others gave them social gravity. People listened to them. This is how power formed quietly, not through force, but through food. Over generations, bread memory reshaped villages. Families known for generosity became central nodes in social networks. Families known for constant need drifted to the edges. Exchange stopped being balanced and became directional. Bread flowed downward. Obligation flowed upward. Eventually, this imbalance created tension. Younger generations questioned why old debts still mattered. Why should they repay bread eaten before they were born? Why should their labor be tied to memories they did not share? These questions rarely became open rebellion, but they changed behavior. People became more cautious. They borrowed less. They gave less. They avoided long-term obligation whenever possible. Exchange narrowed. This shift weakened the old system. When people stopped trusting memory to be fair, they sought alternatives. Written agreements, coin payments, fixed prices. These methods reduced ambiguity but also reduced humanity. Bread became something you bought, not something you owed. But that transition was slow, uneven, and painful. For a long time, both systems coexisted. Bread was still shared, but with hesitation. Still remembered, but with resentment. Still powerful, but no longer unquestioned. And in that uneasy space, something new was forming. A world where survival depended less on who remembered you, and more on what you could pay. But before bread lost its power entirely, it left behind something lasting, a deep cultural memory of obligation tied to food. Even today, traces remain. You know where the storehouse is. Everyone does. It stands slightly apart from the village, larger than any home, thicker walled, roofed more carefully than the rest. Its door is heavy. Its lock is solid. Even when it is closed, you feel its presence. Especially then. This is where your harvest goes before it ever feels like yours. In the medieval countryside, the Lord's storehouse was not just a building. It was the center of gravity. Grain moved toward it the way water moved downhill. Slowly, inevitably, with no need for force. You may have worked the field. You may have sown the seed, pulled the weeds, watched the sky with anxious eyes. But when harvest came, the grain did not move directly to your table. It stopped here first. The storehouse decided how much of your labor you would keep. Rent, in much of medieval Europe, was not paid in money. It was paid in produce and labor. Grain was the most common. Wheat, barley, rye, oats, whatever the land allowed. You delivered a portion of it, measured carefully, into the Lord's storehouse. This was not optional. The amount was usually fixed by custom, not by negotiation. 1/10, 1/6, sometimes more. The measure did not adjust easily for weather, illness, or bad luck. The storehouse did not care why the harvest was small. It only cared what was owed. You could argue, but argument rarely helped. The Lord's steward oversaw the process. He knew the measures. He knew the weights. He knew the rules. If there was disagreement, it favored him. You had no scale of your own. No record to appeal to. What entered the storehouse became invisible to you. Once inside, the grain was counted, redistributed, sold, or stored for later use. You might see it again, in theory. In practice, that depended on circumstances. In years of abundance, the system felt tolerable. You delivered your share. You kept enough. Life continued. The storehouse sat quietly, full but distant. In lean years, it felt different. You watched grain leave your hands knowing your own stores were thin. You knew winter was coming. You knew hunger did not negotiate. But obligation moved first. This was the logic of feudal exchange, protection in return for production. The Lord provided security, at least in theory. His land gave you access. His authority deterred bandits. His justice resolved disputes. In return, you gave him the surplus of your labor. Except surplus was rarely clear. What the system called surplus often felt like necessity. The storehouse also held more than grain. It held tools, seed reserves, sometimes livestock fodder. It was the economic heart of the estate. From here, the lord paid soldiers, hosted guests, supported clergy, and managed famine relief, when he chose to. And that choice mattered. In times of scarcity, the storehouse could become salvation or weapon. A lord might release grain to prevent starvation. Or he might hoard it, waiting for prices to rise in nearby towns. Both actions were legal. Both were remembered. Villagers learned quickly which lords shared and which did not. That knowledge shaped loyalty more than oaths ever did. For some, the storehouse represented stability. In famine years, the lord's reserves sometimes kept people alive. Grain loans were issued, to be repaid later, often with interest measured in future labor or increased rent. For others, it represented control. If you owed grain back to the storehouse, your future was already claimed. Next year's harvest was partially spent before it grew. The storehouse did not forget. Written records began here earlier than in villages. Lords needed to track rents, yields, obligations. Lists were kept. Tallies marked. Parchment filled slowly with names and numbers. Once written, obligation hardened. A mistake in a record could haunt a family for years. A missing delivery, whether real or not, created debt. Debt created pressure. Pressure created obedience. You learned to be careful around the storehouse. Labor obligations were tied to it as well. If you could not pay rent fully in grain, you paid with time. Days spent working the lord's fields, repairing roads, transporting goods, maintaining buildings. This labor was not negotiated hourly. It was owed. The calendar mattered. Certain weeks were reserved for the lord's work, regardless of your own needs. Harvest time was especially demanding. You might work his fields before your own, risking loss, but obligation came first. This is where exchange without money became most visible and most rigid. You were not paid wages. You were fulfilling a duty. The concept of fair pay did not apply. What mattered was compliance. The storehouse stood as proof that the system worked, at least for those at the top. Yet even lords were constrained by it. Their status depended on visible generosity. A lord who let his people starve risked rebellion, flight, or slow decay of his estate. Empty fields produced nothing. So the storehouse was also a balancing act. Too much extraction weakened the base. Too little weakened authority. This tension shaped daily decisions. Women experienced the storehouse indirectly but constantly. They managed what remained after rent. They rationed grain. They decided when to grind, when to save seed, when to stretch meals with substitutes. The storehouse defined the limits of their choices. Children learned its significance early. They carried sacks. They watched grain disappear. They understood that not everything grown belonged to them. The psychological effect was quiet but deep. You did not think of the land as fully yours. You thought of it as borrowed. Conditional. Temporary. This shaped medieval attitudes toward property, work, and fate. Success felt fragile. Failure felt inevitable. And yet, people adapted. They hid small amounts. They negotiated measurements. They delayed deliveries. They cultivated relationships with stewards. Small acts of resistance existed within the system. The storehouse was powerful, but not absolute. Still, it remained the central symbol of a world where exchange flowed upward before it flowed back. After a while, you stop thinking of the storehouse as a place where grain is kept. You begin to think of it as a place where decisions are made. Not openly, not dramatically, quietly. The storehouse does not speak, but it answers questions all the same. Will the grain be released early this year, or held back? Will seed be lent to struggling families, or will they be told to wait? Will the measure be enforced strictly, or will a little be overlooked? Every answer shapes the coming months. As estates grew larger and more organized, the storehouse became more than a repository. It became an instrument of planning. Lords and their stewards compared past harvests, estimated yields, calculated obligations. They were not economists in the modern sense, but they understood patterns. They knew when to press and when to ease. Most villagers did not see this thinking. They only felt its effects. In good years, grain flowed steadily. The storehouse filled early. Deliveries were smooth. The steward was relaxed. Measures were sometimes generous. Small mistakes were ignored. Life felt almost balanced. In bad years, everything changed. Deliveries slowed. Grain arrived lighter, poorer in quality. The steward's tone sharpened. Measures became exact. No extra was tolerated. The door of the storehouse seemed heavier, harder to open. You learned to read these signs. When the storehouse was tense, the estate was tense. This tension filtered into every exchange. Labor obligations increased. If grain could not be collected, time would be. You might be called for extra days of work. Repairs postponed in good years suddenly became urgent. Roads needed clearing. Fences needed rebuilding. None of this was optional. The justification was always the same: protection, order, stability. Yet the burden fell unevenly. Families already struggling were the first to feel pressure. Those with smaller plots or weaker labor capacity found themselves caught in cycles of obligation they could not escape. A missed delivery one year meant heavier demands the next. The storehouse remembered. And now, with written records, it remembered precisely. Tallies were no longer symbolic. They were administrative tools. A notch on a stick represented grain owed. A mark on parchment represented labor expected. These records followed families, not individuals. If you inherited land, you inherited its obligations. This is where the storehouse's power deepened. It reached forward in time. Children grew up knowing part of their future labor was already claimed. Not because of anything they had done, but because of what their land required. Exchange became less about choice and more about continuity. The storehouse also mediated conflict. If disputes arose between villagers, over land boundaries, grazing rights, water access, the Lord's steward often resolved them. His decisions were influenced, consciously or not, by records. A family with a history of compliance fared better than one marked by arrears. Obedience became a form of credit. This credit could not be spent elsewhere, but it mattered here. Some villagers tried to work the system. They delivered early. They offered extra help voluntarily. They cultivated relationships with stewards. A nod, a word, a remembered kindness could soften future demands. Others resisted quietly. They hid grain. They underreported yields. They delayed deliveries until pressed. These acts carried risk. Discovery meant punishment, fines, extra labor, sometimes loss of land. But hunger made risk acceptable. The storehouse was not immune to limits. Grain spoiled. Rodents ate. Roofs leaked. Storage technology was imperfect. Loss was expected, but too much loss raised suspicion. Stewards were accountable upward, to the Lord. Their management was judged by fullness. This pressure trickled down. If the storehouse ran low unexpectedly, someone had failed. That failure would be corrected, by tightening measures, increasing labor, or reclaiming land. In extreme cases, families were expelled. Loss of land was catastrophic. Without access to fields, you lost not only food but status. You became a laborer, dependent on wages or charity. The storehouse no longer recognized you. This possibility haunted everyone. Yet paradoxically, the storehouse could also save lives. During severe famines, some lords opened their reserves. Grain was rationed. Loans were extended. People survived who otherwise would not have. These actions were remembered for generations. A generous lord earned loyalty that outlasted his lifetime. But generosity came at a price. Grain given during famine was rarely free. It was a loan against future harvests. Repayment terms were flexible in words but firm in practice. Once the crisis passed, obligations returned, with additions. Survival today meant pressure tomorrow. This dual nature of the storehouse, protector and extractor, defined feudal life. People depended on it, resented it, feared it, and sometimes trusted it. All at once. As towns expanded and trade increased, some estates began converting part of their grain into coin. Grain from the storehouse was sold in markets. The proceeds funded castles, wars, luxury goods. Villagers rarely saw these coins. Their exchange remained rooted in produce and labor. The storehouse acted as the bridge between subsistence and monetized economy. It absorbed the volatility of peasant life and translated it upward. This translation was not neutral. When prices rose in towns, lords benefited. When prices fell, villagers absorbed the loss. The storehouse insulated those at the top from risk while concentrating it below. Slowly, this imbalance changed attitudes. People began to see the storehouse not as a shared resource but as a boundary. On one side, authority and security. On the other, obligation and scarcity. Trust eroded. Not suddenly, gradually, through repeated small experiences, tight measures, delayed relief, unacknowledged hardship. By the late medieval period, especially after population shocks like the Black Death, this erosion mattered. Labor shortages shifted power slightly downward. Peasants negotiated better terms. Some rents were converted to fixed payments. Some labor obligations reduced. The storehouse adapted. But its symbolic role remained. It was still the place where harvests went before they became lives. It still represented a system where exchange flowed upward before it returned downward. And even as money became more common, the storehouse did not disappear. It changed form. It became granaries, treasuries, warehouses. The logic stayed the same. Control the surplus. Shape the future. Long before the stalls come into view, sound reaches you first, voices overlapping, animals shifting, wood scraping against stone, the low rhythm of bargaining that never fully stops. This is market day, and yet there are no price tags. No fixed numbers. No signs telling you what anything is worth. Value here is not written. It is negotiated. In the medieval world, market days were not governed by stable prices in the way you might expect. Coins existed, yes, but they did not dictate everything. Even when money was used, its value was fluid. A penny today did not mean what it meant last month. Grain shortages, war rumors, weather, distance, all of it reshaped worth constantly. So instead of prices, there were conversations. You arrive carrying what you have: eggs, wool, a small sack of barley, maybe a length of rough cloth. You do not know exactly what you will leave with. That depends on who you speak to, how persuasive you are, and how badly the other person needs what you offer. Nothing is neutral. Markets were social spaces before they were economic ones. Everyone watched everyone else. Who sold quickly? Who held back? Who looked desperate? Who could afford to wait? Desperation lowered value. If you arrived late, your goods might be worth less. If rain threatened, sellers rushed, buyers delayed. Timing mattered as much as substance. You learn quickly to hide urgency. A woman selling butter might pretend she has more at home, even if this is her last batch. A man selling firewood might exaggerate demand elsewhere. These small performances shaped exchange. There was no official opening bell. The market began when people gathered and ended when interest faded. And throughout it all, prices drifted. A pair of shoes might cost 3 eggs early in the morning, 5 by midday, and a sack of grain by afternoon, depending on who was asking and who was answering. No one thought this strange. Stability was not expected. Markets also functioned as places of information exchange. News traveled here: harvest conditions, disease outbreaks, political shifts. This information altered value instantly. If rumors spread of poor crops in the next region, grain prices rose before scarcity arrived. If word came of bandits on the road, tools and weapons gained value. Markets reacted to fear faster than authorities ever could. Guilds and town councils tried to impose order. They set fair prices for essentials like bread and ale. They regulated weights and measures. But enforcement was inconsistent. Outside cities, rules softened quickly. Even inside towns, negotiation persisted. A baker might sell bread at the official price, but quietly offer better loaves to favored customers. A butcher might adjust cuts based on relationship rather than regulation. Personal history mattered. Markets were not anonymous. You carried your reputation with you. If you were known to cheat, people avoided you. If you were known to be fair, negotiation was smoother. Trust shortened conversations. Strangers faced harsher terms. Foreign merchants were both welcomed and resented. They brought new goods but disrupted local balance. Their unfamiliarity made them targets for exploitation, and sometimes violence. Language barriers complicated exchange further. Gestures replaced words. Misunderstandings were common. Deals collapsed easily. In these moments, barter dominated. Goods spoke more clearly than coins. A sack of salt, a knife, a bolt of cloth, these were understood universally. Money required agreement on value. Goods did not. Seasonality shaped markets deeply. In harvest season, grain flooded in. Its value dropped. In winter, grain became precious. Those who could store goods gained advantage. Storage was power. Many people could not store. They sold when forced. Buyers knew this. They waited. This asymmetry created quiet exploitation. Not malicious, just structural. Women were prominent market participants. They sold dairy, eggs, textiles. They negotiated fiercely. Markets were one of the few spaces where women exercised visible economic agency. Yet even here, limits existed. Large transactions, land, livestock, were often controlled by men. Women handled daily exchange. Men handled accumulation. Markets reflected hierarchy. Church influence lingered even here. Certain days were forbidden for trade. Certain goods were frowned upon. Usury was condemned, yet credit existed everywhere, hidden in inflated prices or delayed repayment. Buying now, paying later was common. Debt followed people home from the market. Not formal debt, but remembered imbalance. I gave you more. You owe me next time. These phrases stitched market exchange back into village memory. The market was not separate from daily life. It extended it. Violence sometimes broke out. Disputes escalated. Accusations of cheating led to shouting, sometimes fists. Authorities intervened occasionally, but often the crowd settled matters itself. Justice was public, noisy, and inconsistent. Despite chaos, markets endured. They adapted. They absorbed change. They connected villages to towns, towns to regions, regions to the wider world. And slowly, almost invisibly, they trained people to think differently. To compare. To calculate. To anticipate future value. Even without prices, markets taught arithmetic. They taught strategy. They taught that value was not fixed, but contested. After a few market days, you stop thinking of bargaining as something you do. You begin to think of it as something you are. Every exchange sharpens you. Every failed deal teaches you restraint. Every successful one teaches you silence. You learn when to speak, when to pause, when to walk away, not because you are clever, but because survival rewards attentiveness. Markets slowly train people. You notice patterns. Certain sellers always arrive early. Certain buyers always wait until the end. Some goods move fast and disappear. Others linger until desperation sets in. These rhythms repeat week after week. And those who learn them do better. This learning creates quiet inequality. People with time, those not rushing back to fields or animals, can wait for better terms. People with storage space can hold goods until demand rises. People with information can act before others realize conditions have changed. Markets begin to reward position, not effort. You see this most clearly in grain trading. Smallholders often sell immediately after harvest, when supply is high and prices low. They need tools, salt, clothing. They cannot wait. Larger landholders, merchants, and monasteries buy at this moment. They store. Months later, when grain is scarce, they sell it back, sometimes to the very people who grew it. This is not illegal. It is not hidden. It is simply how markets work. And once people understand this pattern, resentment grows quietly. The idea of a fair price becomes harder to maintain. If value shifts daily, fairness feels temporary. What feels fair in the morning feels exploitative by afternoon. Authorities respond by trying to fix prices again. Bread prices are capped. Ale measures enforced. Fines issued. But enforcement remains uneven. Officials are local. Relationships interfere. Rules bend. Markets continue to operate on negotiation, not regulation. Credit expands further. Buyers promise future payment. Sellers accept, hoping memory will enforce the deal. This brings village-style exchange into market space. Memory follows goods. But markets strain memory. Unlike villages, markets are crowded. People come from multiple settlements. Remembering everyone becomes impossible. Default increases. Disputes rise. To manage this, people narrow trust. They trade more with those they know. Outsiders pay more. Regulars get better terms. Markets become semi-closed networks. Guilds formalize this closure. Craftsmen organize. They restrict who can sell, what can be sold, and when. Officially, this maintains quality. Unofficially, it limits competition. Markets are no longer open fields. They are structured spaces. Still, negotiation remains central. Coins begin to circulate more frequently now, but they do not replace bargaining. They complicate it. Coins vary in purity. Some are clipped. Some foreign. Their value must be assessed each time. You weigh coins the way you weigh grain. Money itself becomes an object of negotiation. Merchants inspect it, bite it, reject it, demand more to compensate for uncertainty. Coins introduce a new layer of argument. Ironically, barter often feels simpler. Markets also reshape social behavior. People become more guarded. You do not reveal how much you need something. You do not reveal how much you have left. Vulnerability costs value. This is a shift. In villages, openness maintained trust. In markets, openness invites exploitation. People learn to perform confidence even when hungry. Women adapt especially quickly. Many become skilled negotiators, using conversation, humor, and reputation to protect value. Markets give them visibility, but also exposure. Mistakes are public. Failure becomes spectacle. Success becomes quiet authority. Over time, markets influence thinking beyond trade. People begin comparing things more abstractly. How many eggs equal a shirt? How much labor equals a sack of salt? These comparisons spread into daily thought. Exchange logic enters the mind. People begin to ask not just, do I need this? But, is this worth it? This question would have felt strange generations earlier. Markets also accelerate inequality between regions. Towns with frequent markets grow wealthier. Villages without access stagnate. Roads gain importance. Tolls appear. Gatekeepers profit. Access becomes currency. As markets expand, so does dependence on them. People grow less self-sufficient. They rely on trade for tools, salt, iron, cloth. When markets fail, due to war, plague, weather, the consequences are immediate. This fragility becomes clear during crises. A blocked road means no salt. A cancelled market means no grain exchange. People who once survived on local networks now struggle. Markets create abundance and dependence. And slowly, the idea of fixed prices begins to feel appealing. Predictability promises safety. Coins promise clarity. Contracts promise stability. The chaos of negotiation starts to wear thin. People do not abandon bargaining overnight. But they begin welcoming systems that reduce uncertainty, even if those systems reduce flexibility. The market, once a space of spoken value, begins drifting toward written value. Numbers replace voices. But before that transition completes, markets leave behind a deep imprint, a habit of calculating worth in relation to others, rather than in isolation. You rarely hear numbers spoken inside a monastery. That is the first thing you notice. The place is full of routine, bells, footsteps, whispered prayers, but calculation happens without noise. No bargaining voices, no shouted prices, no arguments over measure. And yet, nothing here is accidental. Everything is counted. Just not allowed. Medieval monasteries were among the most economically organized institutions of their time. Long before villages kept records, before markets stabilized prices, before lords refined estate management, monasteries were already practicing a quiet, disciplined form of accounting. They did not call it economics. They called it order. When you enter a monastery, you step into a world governed by rhythm. Hours are divided by prayer. Days by labor. Seasons by liturgy. This structure extends naturally into how resources are managed. Grain arrives. Grain is stored. Grain is distributed. Nothing dramatic happens. Nothing visible happens. But underneath the silence, numbers move. Monasteries owned land, sometimes vast amounts of it. Fields, vineyards, mills, fisheries. Peasants worked these lands and paid rent, often in produce or labor. That produce flowed inward, toward monastic storehouses. Unlike the Lord's storehouse, however, the monastery did not exist solely to extract. It existed to persist. This difference mattered. A monastery planned for decades, even centuries. Individual monks came and went. Abbots died. But the institution endured. Its accounting needed to reflect that long horizon. So monks counted carefully. They tracked harvest yields year by year. They noted weather patterns. They recorded shortages and surpluses. They learned how much grain was needed to feed the community through winter, how much seed to reserve for spring, how much could be given away without endangering survival. This was not generosity. It was calculation. Charity was part of monastic identity, but it was rationed. Alms were distributed according to rules. Bread given to the poor was measured. Soup ladled in fixed portions. No monk decided spontaneously. Even mercy followed numbers. Much of this math lived in ledgers, but much more lived in memory reinforced by routine. The same monk measured grain every week. The same brother counted loaves. The same cellarer oversaw stores year after year. Repetition replaced abstraction. You did not need formulas when you had habit. Monasteries functioned as economic stabilizers in unstable regions. During famine, people turned to them. They were known to have reserves. Sometimes those reserves saved lives. Sometimes they did not open. Both outcomes were remembered. A monastery that gave too freely risked collapse. One that gave too little risked moral condemnation and loss of local support. Balancing these pressures required careful calculation, not just of resources, but of reputation. Reputation was another ledger. Monks understood this instinctively. They recorded gifts given and received. A noble donation of land or silver was commemorated in prayers. A village helped in hard times might receive future support. Nothing was forgotten. Unlike markets, monasteries rarely negotiated openly. Exchange happened through structured obligation. Peasants owed rent. Monks owed prayer. Travelers received food according to custom. There was no haggling. This made monasteries appear fair, even when they were strict. Their rules were consistent. Consistency felt like justice. Monastic math also extended into time. Monks thought in cycles. How much grain per monk per day? How many days until Easter? How many mouths during pilgrimage season? These calculations shaped everything from planting decisions to architectural design. Buildings were built to store exact quantities. Ovens sized for predictable output. Refectories arranged for orderly distribution. Space itself was calculated. Silence helped. Without constant noise, patterns became clearer. A missing sack was noticed. A slow depletion raised concern. Excess suggested waste. Waste was sin. This moral framing made accounting sacred. Careful measurement was not just practical, it was virtuous. To miscount was to fail spiritually. This is why monasteries became centers of literacy and record-keeping. Writing preserved order. Tallies protected against forgetfulness. Ledgers replaced reliance on individual memory. Where villages depended on social pressure, monasteries depended on documentation. This difference mattered enormously. Written records outlived people. A monk who mismanaged stores could not hide behind reputation. The books spoke. Over time, monasteries refined techniques that would later spread outward. Standardized measures, annual accounts, inventory lists. These practices did not originate in markets or royal courts. They grew quietly behind cloister walls. And yet, for all this calculation, monasteries still operated largely without money in daily life. Coins existed, but they were peripheral. Most internal exchange was non-monetary. Food was distributed by rule, not purchase. Clothing issued according to need. Tools shared. Labor assigned. This made monasteries feel almost outside the economy. But they were not. They were deeply embedded, just differently organized. Monasteries absorbed surplus from the countryside and redistributed it slowly, predictably. They dampened volatility. In doing so, they gained influence. Villagers trusted monasteries more than lords in some regions. Not because monks were kinder, but because they were consistent. Predictability is comforting when survival is uncertain. Yet this trust created dependency. Villages planned around monastic support. During bad years, people expected help. When it did not come, disappointment turned sharp. Monks knew this. They calculated expectations as carefully as grain. This silent math shaped medieval life in ways rarely noticed. It trained people to think long-term. It introduced the idea that resources could be planned, not just reacted to. It also trained future administrators. Kings and lords often borrowed monks to manage estates. Monastic accounting became secular power. Villagers start adjusting their lives around monastic rhythms. Market days shift to avoid prayer hours. Harvest deliveries align with monastic schedules. Even disputes are timed, brought to monks when the cellarer or abbot is available to listen. The monastery becomes a reference point. Not because it is loud or forceful, but because it is reliable. People begin to compare. They notice that monastic stores rarely empty completely. That monks rarely panic during bad seasons. That bread distribution continues even when village ovens go cold. This steadiness creates a contrast, and contrast creates influence. The monastery becomes a quiet standard of competence. Lords notice this too. Secular estates are chaotic by comparison. Stewards come and go. Records are inconsistent. Obligations are remembered unevenly. But monasteries endure. Their numbers survive deaths, wars, and bad harvests. So lords borrow monks. A brother trained in managing grain is sent to oversee an estate. Another is asked to audit rents. Another to teach scribes how to keep proper accounts. Monastic math migrates into feudal administration. And when it does, it changes tone. In monasteries, calculation is framed as discipline and restraint. In estates, it becomes extraction and optimization. The same tools, ledgers, tallies, inventories, now serve different goals. Numbers stop being protective and start being demanding. Villagers feel this shift even if they cannot name it. Obligations become more exact. Margins shrink. About is replaced with exactly. Discretion disappears. The monastery taught the world how to count. The world learned how to use counting to press harder. Inside monasteries themselves, pressure grows too. As donations increase, so does responsibility. More land means more tenants. More tenants mean more accounting. Monks spend increasing time managing resources and less time in prayer. This creates internal tension. Some monks argue that careful management honors God. Others argue it distracts from devotion. Reform movements emerge, pushing monasteries toward greater austerity, less wealth, simpler accounting. Ironically, even austerity requires calculation. To be poor by choice, you must measure carefully. Some monasteries respond by tightening rules. Charity is reduced, alms limited, bread portions fixed more strictly. Not because monks are cruel, but because sustainability demands it. Villagers feel the difference immediately. Where once the monastery was a safety net, now it feels conditional. Help is still offered, but with clearer limits. Expectations are managed more explicitly. The silent math becomes less invisible. People start to notice that names appear in books. That histories are recorded. That families are classified by need, reliability, and burden. Being known to the monastery is no longer neutral. It can protect you or trap you. Written records now outlive memory. A village might forget a bad year. The monastery does not. Its books remember deficits and generosity alike. These records shape future decisions. Memory becomes institutional. And institutions do not forgive the way people sometimes do. At the same time, monasteries deepen their role as lenders. Grain loans during famine are formalized. Repayment schedules are set. Interest is avoided in language, but not in effect. Extra labor, extended obligations, delayed relief serve the same function. This lending is framed as mercy. And often it is. But it also binds villages tighter to monastic authority. Dependence grows quietly. Monasteries also become centers of calculation beyond food. Time is measured, labor hours recorded, tool use tracked, livestock counted and culled strategically. The idea that everything can be measured begins to feel natural. This mindset spreads. People start thinking in ratios. How much work equals how much food? How many mouths per field? How many years a building must last to justify its cost? These thoughts are not spoken openly. They settle slowly into habit. By the later Middle Ages, monasteries are no longer just spiritual centers. They are economic engines, data repositories, planning institutions. Their silence is no longer innocence. It is authority. And authority invites scrutiny. Critics emerge. Some accuse monasteries of hoarding. Others of exploiting tenants under the cover of holiness. Reformers question why institutions devoted to poverty control so much wealth. The numbers, once hidden, begin to attract attention. And once numbers are questioned, they lose their protective silence. They move slowly across the field, heads down, breath visible in the cold morning air. You know each one by sight. The brown cow with the crooked horn. The older one that limps slightly. The calf born last spring that still stays close to its mother. This is your savings, your insurance, your status. In much of the medieval world, especially beyond cities, beyond markets, beyond reliable coin, cattle were currency. Not metaphorically. Literally, they were how value was stored, transferred, measured, and remembered. When someone asked how rich you were, they did not ask how much money you had. They asked how many cows. Cows mattered because they did many things at once. They produced milk. They produced calves. They pulled plows. They could be slaughtered for meat or hides. They reproduced themselves slowly, predictably, visibly. They turned time into value. A sack of grain could rot. A coin could be clipped or lost. A cow lived. As long as it lived, wealth remained present, walking, eating, breathing in front of you. This made cows ideal currency in societies where storage was risky and trust was personal. You did not hide cows in boxes. You showed them. Ownership was public. Everyone knew whose animals grazed where. Theft was obvious. Disputes were loud. A missing cow could not be quietly ignored. This visibility gave cattle their power. Cows were used to pay fines, to settle disputes, to secure marriages. A bride wealth payment might be counted in cattle. A compensation for injury might be assessed in cows rather than silver. Life-changing events were priced in livestock. If someone killed another person, compensation, where allowed, was often measured in cattle. Not because cows equaled life, but because they equaled survival over time. Cows could keep a family alive for years. That was the point. This system worked best in communities where land was shared or loosely controlled. Pastures were common. Herding was communal. Movement was expected. Wealth moved with you. That mobility mattered. If famine struck one area, cattle could be driven elsewhere. Grain tied you to place. Cows gave options. But cattle-based currency came with its own risks. Cows got sick. They wandered. They died suddenly. Disease could wipe out wealth overnight. Harsh winters killed herds. Raids targeted animals first. A raid that stole cows did not just steal property, it erased future security. This fragility shaped behavior. People guarded cattle fiercely. They slept near them. They organized watches. Violence was more likely when livestock was threatened. Because to lose cows was to fall instantly in status. Cattle ownership defined hierarchy. Families with many cows commanded respect. They could lend animals temporarily. They could absorb losses. Families with few cows lived closer to disaster. Loans were often made in cattle. You might borrow a cow with the agreement to return it later with a calf. This was not interest, officially, but it increased wealth for the lender. The borrower gained milk and labor. The lender gained future growth. Everyone understood the math. This system relied heavily on memory and reputation. There were no written contracts in most cases. A borrowed cow was remembered. A promised calf was expected. Disputes over cattle loans were common. Who owned the calf? Who was responsible if the cow died? Who decided whether neglect or fate was to blame? Custom answered these questions, not law. And custom varied widely. Women were central to cattle economies. They milked cows. They managed dairy products. In some cultures, women controlled cattle wealth directly. In others, they influenced it indirectly through marriage alliances. A woman might bring cattle into a marriage. She might leave with them. These animals represented her security in a world where other assets were controlled by men. Cattle followed bloodlines. Children learned early to count animals, to recognize markings, to remember ownership. These skills mattered more than arithmetic. Counting was visual, not numerical. One cow more or less changed everything. Cattle were also used in ritual. Feasts, religious offerings, seasonal celebrations. Slaughtering a cow was a serious act. It marked importance. It signaled abundance, or desperation. Because once slaughtered, the cow stopped being currency. You consumed value instead of storing it. That decision was never casual. Over time, as towns expanded and coin use spread, cattle-based currency began to retreat, but slowly. Even when coins appeared, cattle retained symbolic and practical value. A fine might be converted into silver, but its amount still referenced cattle equivalents. Laws listed penalties in cows long after coins circulated. Old systems lingered in language. Even today, traces remain in words for wealth and capital, rooted in livestock. But as monetization increased, something changed. Cattle lost flexibility. Taxes demanded coin. Markets preferred money. Lords wanted payment they could store without feeding. Cows became less convenient. Still, for centuries, they remained the most honest form of wealth many people knew. You could not fake a cow. You could not debase it. You could not hide it easily. It stood there, undeniable. Cows need grazing. They need water. They need watching. They get sick at the worst times. They wander. They attract attention. The more you own, the more your life bends around them. Wealth that breathes demands care. This is where the cattle economy begins to change how people live, not just how they trade. Families with large herds cannot move freely anymore. They must stay near pasture, near water, near people who can help guard and manage animals. Wealth anchors them to land. Ironically, what once offered mobility now creates immobility. Those with fewer cows remain flexible. They can migrate, work for others, take risks. Those with many cows become cautious. Loss would be catastrophic. Protection becomes priority. This creates a divide not just between rich and poor, but between cautious and desperate. Cattle-based wealth reshapes social structure. Herd-rich families become centers of influence. Others orbit them, borrowing animals, working as herders, marrying into their networks. Obligation clusters around cows. Borrowing cattle becomes more common in difficult years. A family with no milk borrows a cow. Repayment is delayed. Calves are promised. Time stretches. Debt becomes biological. If the cow produces a calf, the lender expects return. If it does not, tension grows. Nature becomes part of the negotiation. No one can control it. Everyone argues about it. This makes disputes emotionally charged. You cannot separate economics from fate. A dead cow feels like theft even when no one is to blame. As populations grow and land pressure increases, grazing becomes contested. Common pastures shrink. Boundaries harden. Cattle owners push for control. Non-owners resent exclusion. Conflict follows. Lords begin asserting rights over grazing land. Fees are introduced. Restrictions imposed. Suddenly, cows require permission. Currency begins to require regulation. This is a turning point. Once cattle are subject to tolls, taxes, and seizure, they lose some of their reliability as wealth. A cow can be taken by authority in a way grain often cannot. It is visible, trackable, seizable. Power notices this. Cattle become targets in war. Armies steal herds rather than siege towns. It is faster, more efficient. Livestock fuels soldiers and cripples enemies. Raiding economies develop around this logic. Villages respond by hiding cattle deeper, herding at night, dispersing animals. These strategies reduce productivity. Milk output drops. Herd health suffers. Wealth preservation begins to undermine wealth creation. At the same time, coin becomes more attractive, not because it is better, but because it is easier to hide. Easier to carry. Easier to move without noise. Money does not breathe. It does not wander. As markets expand, cattle are increasingly converted into coin for large transactions. A cow is sold to pay a tax. Another to fund a wedding. Another to settle a legal dispute. Each sale reduces future security. People hesitate. This hesitation changes behavior. Cows stop circulating as fluid currency. They become long-term stores, not transactional tools. Day-to-day exchange shifts toward smaller goods, grain, bread, labor. Cattle retreat upward in value hierarchy. They become symbols of status more than instruments of exchange. You still count wealth in cows, but you spend in other ways. This creates layered economies, small transactions handled with barter or coin, large, life-altering ones still measured in cattle equivalents. Language preserves this even as practice changes. Customary law continues referencing cows long after people stop paying in them. Penalties are assessed in cow value, even when paid in silver. Old math lingers. Women's relationship to cattle shifts as well. As herds become more controlled by authorities and markets, women lose direct access in many regions. What was once household-managed wealth becomes formal property. Security moves away from people and into systems. This transition is slow and uneven. In remote regions, cattle remain central for centuries. In towns, they vanish quickly. In borderlands, systems mix. No clean break occurs. But gradually, people notice something profound. Wealth that once required daily attention is being replaced by wealth that can be ignored. This feels like freedom. And danger. Because wealth that can be ignored can also be forgotten. Miscounted. Manipulated. Taken quietly. Cows could not be erased easily. Coins can. As cattle fade from everyday exchange, something human fades with them. The visibility of inequality. The shared knowledge of who has what. The immediate connection between wealth and care. Value becomes abstract. And abstraction changes how people treat it, and each other. You hold out your hands before anyone asks what you can pay. They are rough, scarred in places. The nails are short, cracked from work. These hands explain more about your value than any coin ever could. In much of the medieval world, this was enough. Often, it was everything. Long before wages became standard, long before money settled into predictable use, work itself was currency. Not measured by hours or rates, but by usefulness. What you could do determined what you could receive. If you could build, you ate. If you could mend, you were sheltered. If you could harvest, you survived. Coins were optional. Hands were not. In villages where money rarely circulated, labor filled the gap. A carpenter repaired a roof in exchange for meals over winter. A blacksmith sharpened tools in return for grain at harvest. A midwife received food, cloth, or future help, not payment counted, but support remembered. This was not charity. It was exchange. Skill created obligation, and obligation created security. People knew who could do what. Reputation mattered more than speed. A skilled worker was trusted. An unreliable one was quietly avoided. There were no contracts. Your past work spoke for you. You did not advertise. You were known. This made skill deeply personal. It lived in the body. It aged with you. As long as your hands worked, you had value. When they failed, your place in the exchange system weakened. Old age was not just physical decline, it was economic risk. Apprenticeship was the bridge between childhood and survival. Young people learned by watching, copying, repeating. Payment was not immediate. You worked for years in exchange for knowledge, food, and protection. Learning was an investment. The master gained labor. The apprentice gained future independence. Neither needed money to make it worthwhile. In this system, time replaced cash. You might owe someone weeks of work instead of goods. You might work now for help later. The balance was rarely even, but it was accepted. What mattered was usefulness over time. This made certain skills especially powerful. Smiths, masons, millers, healers, people whose work could not easily be replaced, occupied strong positions. They did not need to beg for exchange. Exchange came to them. Their hands carried authority. Others worked harder for less recognition. Field laborers, haulers, cleaners, their work was essential but abundant. Because many could do it, it carried less leverage. Skill scarcity created hierarchy. Women's labor often existed in this system without acknowledgement. Cooking, cleaning, spinning, brewing, these were forms of exchange that rarely appeared in records. Yet they sustained households and communities. A woman who could brew good ale never lacked trade. A woman who could spin fine thread secured future favors. Payment came in food, help, protection. These exchanges were quiet but constant. Hands also crossed social boundaries more easily than money. A lord might accept labor from a peasant without shame. Coin implied equality. Labor did not. This made work-based exchange socially flexible, but also exploitative. People could be pressured to work more than was fair because there was no fixed measure. How many meals equaled a day of work? How much labor repaid a favor? Answers shifted depending on power. Ambiguity favored the strong. Still, for many, this system felt more human than money. You saw what you gave. You felt what you earned. Exchange happened face to face. There was no abstraction. Workdays were long. Bodies bore the cost. But meaning was immediate. You fixed something. You built something. You helped someone. And you were remembered for it. As markets expanded and money slowly spread, this system did not disappear. It coexisted. People paid some things with coin, others with labor. Hands filled gaps where money failed. Even when coins arrived, they often felt secondary. But change was coming. As towns grew and work specialized, labor began to be measured. Days counted, tasks priced, wages appeared. Skill was still valued, but now in numbers. Hands began to be translated into coin. Something was gained: predictability, portability, independence. Something was lost too. The direct link between work and recognition began to thin. You were paid, not remembered. Once paid, obligation ended. Relationship dissolved. This shift would reshape how people understood work, worth, and each other. People start asking different questions. Not, what can you do? But, how much will it cost? Not, can you help? But, how long will it take? The shift is quiet, but it alters everything. As towns grow and markets expand, labor becomes harder to remember personally. Too many people, too many transactions. Skill no longer lives only in reputation, it needs a number attached to it. This is where wages begin to appear more regularly. At first, wages are flexible. Paid in food, lodging, or mixed coin. A day's work might earn bread and ale. A week's labor might include shelter. The boundary between payment and care remains blurred. But slowly, payment becomes abstract. Coins replace meals. Time replaces trust. A day is worth this much. An hour is worth that. Skill is priced. This brings clarity, but also distance. Once paid, obligation ends. You do not owe gratitude. You do not owe loyalty. The exchange is complete, clean. For some, this feels freeing. A laborer paid in coin can choose where to spend it. A craftsman can move towns. A worker is no longer bound to a single household or master. Money enables mobility. But money also enables dismissal. If your hand's slow, you are simply not hired. There is no shared memory of past help. No obligation to care for you once you stop producing. Skill becomes temporary. This change is hardest on those whose work once relied on long-term relationships, servants, household workers, seasonal laborers. Where once they were fed year-round, now they are paid per task. When tasks end, support ends. Uncertainty grows. Guilds form partly in response to this. Craftsmen organize to protect skill value. They set entry requirements, control training, fix wages informally. This restores some stability, but only for members. Outsiders lose ground. Guilds turn skill into a regulated asset. They preserve standards but also restrict access. Innovation slows. Prices rise. Authority shifts. Hands are still central, but now they are governed. Women feel this change sharply. Many skills they once traded informally, spinning, brewing, caregiving, are absorbed into regulated markets or devalued. Payment becomes sporadic or disappears entirely. Work moves out of the household and into workshops. The home economy shrinks. As labor becomes measured, conflict changes shape. Disputes are no longer about whether work was done, but whether it was worth the price. Quality arguments replace obligation arguments. Courts get involved. Written contracts appear. Terms are specified. Failure becomes legal, not social. This reduces ambiguity, but increases formality. People begin to think of work as something external to identity. You do work. You are not your work. This idea would have felt strange earlier. The separation allows exploitation. If work is separate from the worker becomes replaceable. Wage labor expands in agriculture as well. Large estates hire seasonal workers rather than rely on customary obligation. This reduces long-term responsibility. It increases efficiency. It also increases precarity. When harvest ends, work ends. Those without savings suffer. Money promises independence, but only if it is sufficient and stable. For many, it is not. Still, the system spreads because it solves problems older systems could not. Memory fades. Mobility increases. Scale demands abstraction. Hands alone cannot manage complexity. So labor becomes a line item. And yet, something of the old system lingers. People still judge skill by touch, by outcome, by reliability. Coins may pay, but reputation still matters, especially in smaller communities. The two systems overlap uneasily. This overlap creates tension, but also resilience. When money fails, during war, plague, or inflation, hands remain valuable. Work still feeds people. Even in monetized economies, labor reverts to barter in crisis. This pattern repeats. You live in a place where forgetting is difficult. Not because people try hard to remember, but because there is nowhere for memory to go. It stays. It settles into names, glances, silences. In a medieval village, memory does not belong to individuals, it belongs to the place itself. You feel it every time you walk past the same houses, the same fields, the same paths worn smooth by generations of feet. This is a world where your actions echo longer than your words. There are no archives here, no official records that matter much to you. And yet, everything important is remembered. Who helped during the flood? Who refused grain in the famine? Who borrowed a cow and returned it thin? Who worked hard? Who worked reluctantly? These facts are not written down. They are spoken quietly, passed sideways, embedded in stories told without emphasis. Village memory is not precise, but it is persistent. You learn early that nothing is truly private. A loud argument carries. A missed obligation is noticed. Even kindness is tracked, not celebrated, but stored. Memory becomes currency. If you have a history of helping, people help you faster. If you have a history of taking, people hesitate. Exchange does not start fresh each time. It begins already tilted by what is remembered about you. This is how trust functions without contracts. You are trusted not because of who you are today, but because of who you have been repeatedly. The village remembers patterns, not moments. A single mistake might be forgiven. A repeated one becomes identity. Once identity settles, it is hard to shift. You become the reliable one, the difficult one, the needy one, the generous one. These labels are never announced. They are assumed. Children absorb them unconsciously. They learn who they can ask for help. Who will say yes? Who will expect repayment? Who will remind them later? By the time you are grown, you already carry a reputation you did not choose. Family history matters deeply here. You are not only yourself, You are your parents' child, your grandparents' descendant. Their actions cling to you. If your father defaulted on an obligation, you may feel it years later in subtle ways. If your grandmother was known for feeding others, that warmth still lingers around your name. Memory stretches across generations. This makes change slow. You cannot easily reinvent yourself. There is no anonymity. Even leaving and returning does not erase memory. Absence creates suspicion. Return invites scrutiny. Why did you leave? What did you do while you were gone? These questions hang unspoken. Village memory also enforces fairness, but its version of fairness is uneven. It is based on precedent, not equality. If you have managed before, you are expected to manage again. If you struggled once, help might come, but only to a point. Compassion has limits defined by memory. During hard times, this becomes stark. When grain is scarce, people do not share equally. They share strategically. They help those who have helped before. Those who are remembered well survive longer. Memory decides who eats first. This is not cruelty. It is survival logic. But it means that past failure can cost future life. Village councils, where they exist, rely heavily on memory. Disputes are settled by recalling precedent. Last time this happened carries weight. Witnesses matter less than shared recollection. Truth is communal. This can be protective. Outsiders cannot easily exploit the system. Lies struggle to survive when many people remember differently. But it can also trap. If the village remembers you wrongly, or partially, that version of you can become permanent. There is no appeal process. No higher authority that understands your context. You are known. Women experience village memory differently. Their actions are remembered more intimately, more persistently. Domestic behavior, relationships, reputation, these linger. Forgiveness is slower. Judgment quieter but deeper. Men's labor is remembered. Women's conduct is remembered. Both carry consequences. Village memory also governs exchange over long periods. You might receive help now because of something you did years ago. Or be denied because of something you failed to do. This creates a long arc of obligation. Nothing is settled quickly. Balance is achieved slowly, over seasons, sometimes over lifetimes. This makes exchange feel stable, but heavy. You carry invisible weight with you, expectations, debts, credits that exist only in people's minds. You cannot see them, but you feel them in how people speak to you, how quickly doors open, how willingly help arrives. Village memory rewards consistency, not brilliance. It discourages risk. A bold failure is remembered more sharply than a cautious success. Innovation threatens stability. Doing things differently invites scrutiny. So people repeat what works. This is why medieval villages change slowly. Not because people lack imagination, but because memory enforces caution. Still, memory is not static. Over time, it shifts. New stories replace old ones. Death clears some accounts. Birth adds new names. Plague, war, famine, these events disrupt memory violently. When too many die, memory fractures. Stories are lost. Obligations dissolve. In those moments, villages feel strangely light, and dangerously unmoored. But in ordinary times, memory holds everything together. It replaces law. It replaces money. It replaces contracts. Over time, you start to notice that village memory does more than remember. It sorts. Quietly, steadily, without ever announcing its decisions. People begin to respond to you before you speak. Offers come, or do not, based on what is already assumed. Help arrives early for some, late for others. No one says why. No one needs to. Memory has already decided. This is where the long memory of the village stops being merely social and starts becoming structural. It shapes access to resources, to labor, to protection. It determines who is trusted with tools, with animals, with responsibility. And once that happens, memory starts to look a lot like power. If the village remembers you as reliable, you are asked to witness disputes. Your word carries weight. You are trusted with shared property. You are consulted before decisions are made. If the village remembers you as unreliable, your voice fades. You are spoken about rather than spoken to. You are excluded from small opportunities long before anything dramatic happens. Nothing official marks this change. You simply feel the village narrowing around you. This sorting intensifies during crisis. When famine comes, memory hardens. Grain is shared selectively. Labor is allocated strategically. Those remembered as contributors are supported first. Those remembered as burdens are helped last, or not at all. Survival becomes retrospective. You live, or don't, based partly on what you did years earlier. This is not cruelty in the village's own understanding. It is efficiency. Resources are limited. Trust must guide allocation. Memory is the fastest way to decide. But it means that redemption is difficult. A family that fell into need once may carry that mark long after circumstances change. Even if they recover, suspicion lingers. They struggled before. That phrase never fully fades. Likewise, generosity can become a trap. Families known for helping are asked repeatedly. Their resources drain faster. Their refusal, when it finally comes, feels like betrayal. Reputation demands consistency, even when it hurts. You begin to realize that memory is conservative. It prefers stability to fairness. It resists updating itself. New information is weighed against old impressions, and old impressions usually win. Change is slow because forgetting is slow. This affects innovation deeply. A new method of farming fails once? It is remembered. That failure discourages others for years. A new tool breaks? The memory of its failure outlasts its usefulness. Village memory punishes experimentation. So people stick with what is known to work, even if it works poorly. As generations pass, memory begins to thin, not because people forget, but because too much has happened. Stories simplify. Details blur. People are remembered in outlines rather than specifics. The family that always struggled. The line that never cooperated. The ones who helped during the flood. Accuracy gives way to narrative. At this point, memory becomes less about truth and more about identity. And identity becomes destiny. You may find yourself living a role you did not choose, repeating patterns expected of you. Attempts to act differently feel awkward, suspicious. People watch closely, waiting to see if this change will last. One good year is not enough. Village memory demands repetition before revision. External forces eventually interfere. Lords impose written records. Churches keep lists. Markets introduce coin. These systems weaken memory's grip by offering alternatives to reputation. A debt can be paid in coin instead of goodwill. Labor can be hired instead of requested. A dispute can be taken outside the village. For some, this is liberation. For others, it is loss. The village no longer remembers as completely. Relationships loosen. Obligations dissolve faster. You gain freedom, but lose protection. Memory fragments. People begin to rely less on communal knowledge and more on documents, contracts, money. These tools forget efficiently. They reset relationships. But villages do not forget overnight. For a long time, memory and systems coexist uneasily. Written law says one thing. Village memory says another. People navigate both, choosing whichever serves them best. Eventually, as populations grow and mobility increases, memory loses dominance. Too many people pass through. Too many interactions occur. The village can no longer hold everything. When that happens, something fundamental shifts. Life becomes lighter and lonelier. You are less judged by your past, but also less carried by it. Help is transactional. Trust is limited. Relationships reset quickly. You can avoid the market if you stay home. You can delay the Lord's labor for a day, sometimes two. But you cannot avoid the church. Its demands arrive quietly, regularly, and without negotiation. In the medieval world, long before modern taxation systems existed, the church operated one of the most stable and unavoidable systems of extraction in daily life: the tithe. 1/10 of what you produced, grain, wine, livestock, eggs, honey, was owed, not to a person, but to God, administered by people. This distinction mattered. You could argue with the Lord. You could bargain in a market. But you could not bargain with God. The tithe was not presented as payment. It was framed as duty. Failure to pay was not just disobedience, it was sin. And sin followed you far beyond hunger or debt. It followed you into eternity. This made church demands uniquely powerful. The tithe applied regardless of circumstance. A good harvest? You paid. A bad harvest? You still paid, because God had still given you something. Illness, weather, loss, war, none of these cancelled obligation. You might eat less. You might sell tools. You might borrow. But the tithe came first. Collection methods varied, but the pressure was constant. In some regions, priests collected produce directly. In others, appointed collectors, often locals, handled it. Everyone knew when tithe season approached. Grain was measured, livestock counted, excuses weighed and usually rejected. The church kept records. Unlike village memory, these records were written. They lasted. A missed tithe did not fade with time. It waited. And unlike the Lord's storehouse, the church framed its extraction as moral balance. Giving purified you. Paying cleansed the soul. Refusal polluted it. This language changed how people experienced loss. When grain left for the Lord, you felt resentment. When grain left for the church, you felt fear. Fear of damnation. Fear of exclusion. Fear of burial denied in consecrated ground. Fear of being remembered as impious. Church demands extended beyond tithes. Fees appeared everywhere. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, blessings, masses for the dead. None were officially sold, but none were free. You paid for salvation in pieces. Even prayer had an economy. The poor were not exempt. In theory, charity flowed downward. In practice, obligation flowed upward. A poor family might receive alms, only to be reminded later of unpaid dues. Debts to the church accumulated invisibly. And because the church outlived individuals, it remembered longer than any village ever could. This endurance gave it leverage. Unlike lords, priests did not need to threaten violence. Their power was quieter. It operated through conscience, ritual, and social pressure. A person known to resist church demands became suspect. Neighbors noticed. Trust weakened. Religion was communal. Sin was public. You could not hide refusal. Church taxes also overlapped with secular ones. A family might owe grain to the Lord, labor to the estate, and a tenth to the church, all from the same harvest. The burden stacked. What you produced passed through multiple hands before reaching your table. Women often managed these calculations. They decided which grain went where. Which portion could be spared. Which obligation could be delayed. Their choices shaped survival. They also carried blame. If a tithe was missed, it was often the household that was judged morally, not the system that demanded too much. Over time, resentment grew, but it stayed quiet. Open defiance risked spiritual consequences few were willing to face. Instead, people complied reluctantly, creatively. They hid produce. They underreported yields. They substituted poorer goods. They delayed. They begged forgiveness. Forgiveness was sometimes granted, sometimes not. The church was not uniform. Some priests were merciful, others strict. Local relationships mattered, but doctrine loomed larger. You might survive hunger. But could you survive guilt? This is what made church demands different from all other forms of exchange. They did not just take from your body. They reached into your sense of right and wrong. After a while, you stop asking whether you can pay. You start asking how. The church's demands do not rise suddenly. They accumulate, slowly, patiently. Each obligation seems manageable on its own, a tenth here, a fee there, a gift on a holy day, but together they form a net that tightens over time. You begin to feel it most clearly in the margins. The grain left after rent and tithe is thinner. The animals kept after dues are fewer. The money left after fees disappears faster. There is no single moment when you fall behind, just a gradual sense that you are always catching up. And catching up never quite works. What makes church demands especially difficult is their timing. Tithes are often collected when produce is most visible, after harvest, when stores are full but future hunger is already certain. Payment feels premature. You are asked to give away what you will need later. Faith asks you to trust that God will provide. Your body asks you to count again. As obligations stack, people begin prioritizing. Not openly, but quietly. A family might delay rent to the Lord but never the tithe. Another might short the tithe but pay burial fees promptly, fearing consequences for the dead more than the living. This is where morality becomes economic. Decisions are no longer about fairness, but about fear. Which penalty is worse, hunger now, or punishment later? Which authority remembers longer, the steward or the priest? Often, the answer is the church. Excommunication, even informal, is devastating. It isolates you socially. Neighbors hesitate. Trade slows. Help dries up. You are alive, but cut off. So people comply even when it hurts. The church's power deepens because it operates through community enforcement. Priests do not need to chase defaulters. Neighbors notice who pays and who does not. Shame does the work. During crisis, this system strains. Famine exposes its limits. When too many cannot pay, strict enforcement risks rebellion or mass suffering. Some priests loosen demands. Others do not. The difference is remembered. Villages learn which churches show mercy and which show rigidity. Attendance shifts. Loyalty erodes. Resentment simmers. This resentment does not disappear, it waits. Over time, people begin to question quietly. Not doctrine, but administration. Why does the church require so much? Where does it go? Why does holiness look like storage and surplus? These questions remain unspoken for generations. The church also becomes entangled with secular taxation. Kings borrow from it. Lords collect tithes on its behalf. Boundaries blur. What was once God's demand starts to feel like another human system. Faith becomes complicated. People still believe, but they distinguish belief from institution. You can feel this shift in behavior. People pay, but with less devotion. They comply, but without warmth. The act becomes mechanical. Tithes turn from offering into obligation. And obligation breeds resistance, not open, but internal. By the late medieval period, this tension becomes impossible to ignore. Reform movements begin stirring. Critics point to excess, to hoarding, to burdens placed on the poor. These critiques do not start with theology. They start with hunger. People remember what they gave, and what they received in return. Some reforms succeed. Others fail. Some churches adjust. Others entrench. The system does not collapse overnight. It bends. But the relationship between people and church demands is permanently altered. The tithe no longer feels sacred. It feels required. And once something sacred becomes routine, it loses some of its power. You arrive with nothing that proves who you are. No family standing. No remembered favors. No reputation carried ahead of you. Only dust on your shoes and a story you hope sounds believable. In the medieval world, travel stripped people of their most valuable asset, memory. The moment you left your village, the long ledger of who you were vanished. Beyond familiar fields and known faces, you were no longer reliable, generous, or difficult. You were simply unknown. And unknown was dangerous. Travelers lived in a fragile space between necessity and suspicion. Roads were essential, carrying goods, news, labor, and ideas, but those who walked them existed outside the safety net of village memory. They survived on something more fragile, temporary trust. Trust that lasted a night, a meal, a mile. Nothing more. You might be a pilgrim, a merchant, a messenger, a laborer, a runaway. Your reason mattered less than your behavior. Hosts judged you quickly, by your speech, your posture, your clothing, your willingness to work. You learned to perform trustworthiness. Eyes lowered, but not shifty. Polite, but not needy. Grateful, but not demanding. Hospitality was a moral obligation in medieval Christianity. Inns, monasteries, and private homes were expected, at least in theory, to shelter travelers. But obligation did not mean safety. Hospitality came with conditions. You were fed modestly, watched closely, asked questions that sounded casual but were not. Where are you from? Where are you going? Who do you know there? Your answers became currency. Pilgrims carried symbols, badges, letters, scars of travel, that helped. Merchants carried goods. Laborers carried tools. These objects acted as proof of purpose. Purpose created trust. Those without it struggled. Payment rarely came in coin alone. Travelers often paid with stories, labor, news. You might fix a fence in exchange for a bed. Share rumors in exchange for bread. Carry a message onward as payment for shelter. Information had value. So did effort. Inns operated on thin margins. They extended credit cautiously. A traveler who could not pay immediately might promise future payment, at the next town, after a sale, upon reaching a shrine. These promises were rarely enforceable. Trust was temporary because enforcement was impossible. This made hosts selective. Some travelers were refused outright. Others were charged more. Outsiders paid higher prices, not out of cruelty, but risk management. Risk shaped hospitality. Monasteries were different, but not always kinder. They offered structured hospitality, limited food, limited stay, strict rules. A night or two, no more. Charity, but controlled. The monastery fed bodies, but did not invest in them. Travelers learned to keep moving. Roadside exchange developed its own rules. You did not demand. You asked. You did not linger. You left early. You repaid kindness with courtesy and speed. Staying too long turned help into burden. Temporary trust was maintained by motion. Danger was constant. Bandits targeted travelers because they were isolated. Locals suspected them because they disrupted memory-based systems. Even fellow travelers were not always safe. Trust among strangers was thin and transactional. You shared fires. You shared meals. But you slept lightly. Women travelers faced greater risk. Their trustworthiness was judged more harshly. Hospitality could turn predatory. Many traveled disguised, accompanied, or avoided roads entirely. Temporary trust did not protect equally. Still, travelers kept moving because movement offered something villages could not: reset. On the road, past mistakes mattered less. Debts faded with distance. Reputation dissolved. You could start again, briefly. This freedom came at a price. You traded protection for possibility. Markets depended on travelers. So did ideas. So did change. Without them, systems stagnated. Yet travelers themselves remained marginal, necessary, distrusted, tolerated but rarely welcomed. Their exchanges were short-term by necessity. A loaf for a story. A bed for a promise. A repair for safe passage. Nothing long enough to build memory. And this creates a quiet tension at the heart of medieval exchange. Societies built on long memory depended on people who had none. After a few weeks on the road, you stop expecting trust to last. You begin to feel its edges. How it forms quickly and dissolves just as fast. How a friendly face at dusk can turn cautious by morning. Temporary trust, you learn, is not meant to survive daylight. It is designed to get you through the night. Hosts grow careful once the immediate obligation of hospitality has been fulfilled. You are fed. You are sheltered. Now you must go. Staying longer shifts the balance. Gratitude turns into scrutiny. Kindness becomes calculation. Are you still here? Shouldn't you be moving on? No one says these words directly. They are expressed in glances, shorter replies, the absence of an offered meal. Temporary trust signals its own ending. Travelers adapt. You learn to leave before you are asked. To pack quietly. To express thanks quickly and sincerely. Lingering feels dangerous, not because of violence, but because of memory. If you stay too long, you risk being remembered. And being remembered without belonging is risky. Temporary trust works best when it remains temporary. This shapes the rhythm of travel. Roads become chains of short encounters rather than long relationships. Each stop resets identity. Each village requires a new performance of reliability. You repeat the same story again and again, adjusting details based on reaction. Over time, even truth becomes flexible. Not because you intend to deceive, but because survival demands adaptability. Trust becomes rehearsed. Certain categories of travelers learn to manage this better than others. Merchants develop predictable routes. Familiar faces reappear. Over time, their temporary trust becomes semi-permanent. People begin to recognize them. Recognition changes everything. Once known, a traveler stops being a stranger. Prices soften. Credit appears. Help arrives more readily. But this comes at a cost. Reputation now follows you. Mistakes linger. Freedom narrows. Some travelers prefer to remain unknown. Day laborers and seasonal workers often avoid repeating routes. Their trust remains brief, efficient, untraceable. They trade stability for flexibility. Messengers and officials operate differently. They carry authority instead of reputation. Seals, letters, uniforms grant them immediate trust, but also make them targets. Authority is a loud kind of trust. Pilgrims occupy a special space. Their purpose grants moral credit. People feed them not because they are known, but because their journey is considered holy. Yet even pilgrims are monitored. Fraud is suspected. False pilgrims are punished harshly. Trust based on symbols invites imitation and suspicion. As travel increases, informal systems develop to manage temporary trust. Certain inns gain reputations for fairness. Certain routes are considered safer. Word spreads, quietly, person to person. Information becomes currency again. Travelers trade warnings more than goods. Avoid that road. That inn cheats. This monastery is strict but fair. These exchanges save lives. Temporary trust begins to stack, not in individuals, but in places. Some towns benefit. Others suffer. Reputation extends beyond people to geography. A place known for betrayal empties. A place known for fairness thrives. Trust migrates. Authorities notice this. They begin regulating inns, issuing travel documents, marking safe roads. These efforts formalize trust, but also control it. Papers replace stories. This marks a subtle shift. Temporary trust becomes institutional. You are trusted not because of how you behave tonight, but because of what you carry. This reduces negotiation, but increases exclusion. Those without documents struggle. The poor, the displaced, the suspiciously different. Trust hardens into policy. The road grows less forgiving. Yet even then, temporary trust never disappears entirely. Systems fail. Documents are lost. Borders blur. In these moments, people fall back on older instincts. A shared fire. A shared meal. A shared silence. Temporary trust remains the emergency currency of human movement. It allows societies to function beyond memory-based systems. It enables exchange between strangers. It spreads goods, ideas, diseases, and change. But it also reminds everyone of something uncomfortable. Without long memory, trust must be fragile. And fragility demands constant vigilance. So as you walk away from the last village, carrying nothing but what you can convince the next one to believe about you, a final question follows like a quiet companion on the road. You wake before most people do. Not because anyone asked you to, but because the work begins whether you rise or not. The fire must be fed. Water fetched. Grain measured. Dough mixed. Children stirred. Animals milked. None of this appears in records. None of it earns coin. And yet, without it, nothing else functions. This is the economy that does not announce itself. In the medieval world, women's labor formed a vast, continuous system of production and exchange that rarely passed through markets or accounts. It did not look like work in the way plowing or smithing did. It looked like life happening. Because of that, it was easy to overlook. But this invisible economy was not small. It was not secondary. It was foundational. Women managed food from field to table. They processed grain into flour, flour into bread, bread into meals that sustained laborers who did appear in records. They brewed ale, often the safest drink available. They preserved food for winter. They rationed in lean times. They decided who ate first and who ate less. These decisions were economic decisions. They determined survival. Women also produced goods that circulated constantly through barter and gift exchange. Spun thread, woven cloth, dairy products, eggs, soap, candles. These items rarely traveled far, but they moved steadily between households. A bowl of butter might pay for help tomorrow. A length of cloth might settle a small debt. A jug of ale might secure goodwill. None of this involved money. All of it involved value. This economy relied on skill and timing rather than scale. Women knew when to give and when to hold back. They understood the rhythms of need. Who was struggling? Who could repay later? These judgments were quiet, precise, and rarely questioned. Because they worked. Women's exchange networks overlapped with village memory but operated on finer detail. While men remembered major events, harvest failures, disputes, obligations, women remembered daily balance. Who had enough? Who did not? Who could be asked? Who should be spared? This knowledge was not written down. It lived in habit and observation. It was trusted because it was accurate. Childcare was another pillar of this invisible economy. Not just bearing children, but raising them, feeding them, teaching them survival skills. This labor produced future workers, future producers, future caretakers. No lord paid for this. No church taxed it. But everyone depended on it. Women also managed health in a world with limited medicine. They treated wounds, delivered babies, cared for the sick and dying. These services were exchanged informally, through gratitude, future help, protection. A woman known for healing was valuable beyond measure. Payment might come months later. Or not at all, but the relationship endured. This made women central to social cohesion. They smoothed conflict. They mediated disputes quietly. They maintained connections across households through shared work and shared care. Yet because this economy operated within homes and between neighbors, it was rarely acknowledged as economic power. It did not accumulate visibly. It did not build monuments. It did not leave records. It simply continued. When coin entered villages, women's economy adapted, but not always in ways that benefited women. Some of their work was monetized. Brewing moved into male-dominated guilds. Textile production shifted toward workshops. Skills once traded freely became regulated or excluded. What had been household exchange became market commodity. Women lost access. At the same time, much of their labor remained unpaid and uncounted. Cooking, cleaning, caregiving, still essential, still invisible. The contradiction deepened. Women's work remained necessary, but its value became harder to claim. Despite this, women continued to manage scarcity. They absorbed shock during famine. They stretched resources. They sacrificed first. Their bodies often bore the cost of keeping others alive. History rarely recorded this. But if you look closely, at survival rates, at household stability, at continuity through crisis, you can see the imprint of this invisible economy everywhere. It was the system beneath all other systems. After years pass, something subtle happens. The work does not slow, but attention to it does. People begin to assume that things will simply continue. Meals will appear. Children will be cared for. The sick will be tended. Clothes will be mended. Winter stores will somehow last. The invisible economy becomes background noise, noticed only when it falters. And when it falters, blame appears quickly. If food runs short, questions are asked. If children fall ill, suspicion rises. If resources are mismanaged, responsibility is quietly assigned. Women feel this pressure constantly. Because their work is continuous, it is expected to be perfect. There is no margin for visible failure. Success looks like nothing happening at all. This expectation hardens over time. As villages grow and systems formalize, women's labor becomes increasingly categorized as natural rather than economic. Cooking is not production. Care is not labor. Organization is not management. These are framed as instinct, duty, or character. Once framed that way, they stop being negotiable. You cannot ask to be paid for instinct. You cannot refuse a duty without moral consequence. This is where invisibility turns into constraint. Women's exchange networks continue to operate, but under growing pressure. They are asked to absorb shortages created elsewhere. When rents rise, when tithes increase, when markets fluctuate, households lean harder on women's ability to make it work. Stretch more. Share less. Endure quietly. The economy adjusts downward through women's bodies and time. This adjustment is not recorded anywhere. No ledger shows how much more work is done. No account lists how many meals were skipped, how much sleep was lost, how often illness was ignored. But the adjustment happens anyway. During famine, this becomes stark. Women eat last. Women reduce their own portions. Women give up their share so others can survive. This is framed as virtue, not necessity. Sacrifice becomes expectation. At the same time, women's informal authority begins to worry institutions. Their networks are efficient. Their influence is real. They control daily distribution of food and care. They decide who receives help first. This power is quiet, but visible to those who watch closely. So systems begin to intervene. Midwifery is regulated. Healing knowledge is restricted. Brewing is licensed. Textile production is moved into workshops. Women are excluded from guilds or allowed only marginal participation. The invisible economy is not dismantled, but parts of it are absorbed. What can be taxed is taxed. What can be regulated is regulated. What cannot be controlled is dismissed. Women's work becomes split, some of it monetized and taken over, the rest left unpaid and unprotected. This creates a double burden. You work the same, or more, but with less authority over outcomes. Decisions move upward. Rules are written elsewhere. Your knowledge is consulted less. Your responsibility remains. And still, everything depends on you. Women adapt, as they always have. They adjust networks, share information quietly, support one another, exchange help in ways that avoid scrutiny. They keep the system alive. But the cost grows. As money becomes more central, women's access to it remains limited. Wages go to men. Payments are made to households, not individuals. Women contribute labor but do not control income. Dependence increases. Independence narrows options. Leaving becomes harder. Resistance riskier. Silence safer. Yet even under these constraints, women's economy remains resilient. It does not disappear. It reshapes itself. It finds new paths, through kinship, through care, through shared survival strategies. It is slower now, more hidden, but still active. And when formal systems fail, as they often do during war, plague, or collapse, it is this invisible economy that reasserts itself first. Food is shared. Care resumes. Survival reorganizes around the familiar patterns women have always maintained. In crisis, visibility returns briefly. Then fades again. This cycle repeats across centuries. The invisible economy saves lives. It is praised in moments of desperation, then forgotten once stability returns. You do not owe things all at once. You owe them eventually. That is how payment works here, not measured by dates on a calendar, but by the turning of the year. Spring, harvest, winter. Payment is seasonal, because life is seasonal. Nothing arrives evenly. Nothing is settled quickly. In the medieval world, time itself functioned as currency. You feel this the moment someone says, after harvest, or, by Martinmas, or, when the fields are cleared. These phrases are not vague. They are precise in a way that clocks are not. Everyone understands what they mean. They define when payment becomes possible. Money assumes steady flow. Medieval life did not have that luxury. Grain arrived once a year. Livestock reproduced on nature's schedule. Labor peaked and vanished. So payment followed the same rhythm. You paid when you could, not when you owed. Rent was due after harvest, not before. Debts were repaid once grain was threshed and stored. Taxes, tithes, fees, all clustered around moments when resources were visible and countable. This made obligation feel postponed, but also inevitable. The months between payments were not free. They were anticipatory. You lived knowing that part of what you held was already spoken for. A portion of your future belonged to someone else. This shaped how you behaved all year. In spring, you planted knowing the harvest was already divided. In summer, you worked knowing what share would leave your hands. In autumn, you delivered knowing winter would test what remained. Seasonal payment created long memory. A missed obligation did not disappear. It waited. Everyone knew when it would return. Failure was not immediate, it was deferred. This deferment made the system feel patient. It was not. If you failed to pay at the expected season, the consequences were heavier precisely because you had been given time. Excuses carried less weight. You had the whole year, was the unspoken response. Seasonal payment rewarded planning and punished disruption. Illness, weather, death, these things broke planning. When they did, payment systems strained. A family might ask for delay. Sometimes it was granted. Often it was not. Delay turned into debt. Debt extended into the next season, and the next. Obligations layered. Time, once a buffer, became pressure. Seasonal systems also reinforced hierarchy. Those with reserves could wait. Those without could not. Lords and monasteries collected at fixed times. They did not accept partial payment easily. You either had enough, or you did not. Women managed much of this seasonal accounting. They knew what could be spared now and what must be saved for later. They rationed through winter with the knowledge that spring was coming, but that spring brought new demands. Seasonal payment trained people to think ahead, but also to fear the future. Winter was not just cold. It was the space between obligations. During winter, you did not pay, but you remembered. Every loaf eaten reduced what you could deliver later. Every animal slaughtered narrowed future options. Survival and obligation competed quietly. Seasonal labor followed similar rhythms. You owed days of work, at harvest, during plowing, after shearing. These were predictable burdens. You planned your own work around them. Except when plans failed. A delayed harvest compressed labor. Suddenly, you owed many days at once. Exhaustion mounted. Mistakes happened. Crops suffered. Time became crowded. This crowding revealed how fragile seasonal systems were. They worked only when nature cooperated. When it did not, everything overlapped: work, payment, hunger. Seasonal payments also shaped psychology. People learned patience, endurance, acceptance of delay. Immediate gratification was rare. You waited. And waiting became skill. But waiting also meant uncertainty. Would the harvest be enough? Would obligations increase? Would illness strike before payment time? Seasonal systems rewarded those who could absorb shock. Everyone else lived close to collapse. As markets and money expanded, seasonal payment began to feel restrictive. Fixed dates promised clarity. Monthly wages promised stability. Regular taxation promised predictability. But predictability came at a cost. It demanded constant flow in a world built on cycles. This tension would grow sharper with time. After enough years pass, you start to realize that the seasons are no longer carrying the weight they once did. They still turn. They still structure life. But they stop protecting you. Seasonal payment was meant to spread pressure across time, to give people space to recover, to plan, to breathe between obligations. But as demands accumulate, that space narrows. What was once a rhythm becomes a countdown. You begin to live toward payment rather than through the year. Each season is no longer complete in itself. Spring is already haunted by autumn. Summer is shadowed by the measuring basket. Winter is not rest, it is anticipation. This anticipation reshapes behavior. You plant more cautiously. You take fewer risks. You avoid borrowing because repayment will coincide with rent, tithe, and tax all at once. Seasonal obligations begin to synchronize, and that synchronization is dangerous. When everything is due at the same time, failure multiplies. A single poor harvest now affects multiple obligations simultaneously. You cannot prioritize easily. If you pay the Lord, you may fail the church. If you pay the church, you may lose land. If you save food, you default on both. Choice becomes illusion. This is where seasonal systems start producing permanent debt. A missed payment does not disappear with the next season. It carries forward, often with additions. Extra labor days, increased rent, reduced trust. Seasonal delay becomes cumulative pressure. Time stops resetting the balance. People respond by selling future security. A cow sold to meet autumn dews means less milk next year. Seed grain eaten in winter means weaker planting in spring. Seasonal payment forces short-term survival at long-term cost. This creates downward spirals that are difficult to escape. Lords and institutions notice this, but often too late, or not at all. From their perspective, payment is simply late. The reasons feel repetitive. Excuses sound the same every year. From your perspective, time has become crowded. There is no longer a good season to recover. Seasonal labor obligations worsen this compression. If weather delays harvest, labor demands intensify. Everyone needs help at once. You owe work to the Lord while your own crops wait. You choose obligation over self-preservation because the consequences are clearer. Your harvest suffers. Next season worsens. This pattern repeats across regions and decades. Seasonal systems that once adapted to uncertainty now amplify it. People begin to feel trapped by time itself. This is one reason why fixed payments start to appear appealing, even to those they disadvantage. Monthly rents, annual cash taxes, regular wages promise distribution instead of concentration. They spread pressure. They do not wait. For some, this feels safer. For others, it feels relentless. There is no pause, no season of relief. Payment becomes constant rather than episodic. But constancy removes the cliff. Seasonal payment systems begin breaking down unevenly. In remote areas, they persist longer. In towns and monetized regions, they fade quickly. Hybrid systems emerge, some dues seasonal, others fixed. These hybrids are confusing. People miscalculate. Obligations overlap unpredictably. One system assumes cycles, the other assumes flow. Households caught between them struggle most. Women bear much of this confusion. They manage stores based on seasons but face demands based on dates. Their calculations no longer align with authorities' expectations. What once worked intuitively now requires abstraction. This increases stress. Mistakes multiply. Blame follows. Over time, seasonal payment loses its moral framing. It no longer feels natural. It feels imposed. Time stops being shared context and becomes weapon. You had the whole year, authorities say. Yes, people think, and the whole year was already spent. Seasonal payment also affects how people experience the future. Hope narrows. Long-term planning becomes risky. You focus on getting through the next obligation rather than building stability. This limits ambition. It limits innovation. Why improve yields if increased production simply raises dues? Why save if savings are counted as ability to pay? Seasonal systems unintentionally punish success. This insight spreads quietly. People hide surplus. Underreport yields. Store secretly. Seasonal payment encourages concealment. Trust erodes. Institutions respond with stricter measures, more inspections, tighter records, less flexibility. Seasonal systems harden into calendars and penalties. At that point, time stops being organic. It becomes administrative. The seasons still turn, but they no longer negotiate. At first, nothing seems broken. The fields look the same. The paths are still there. The routines continue, almost stubbornly so. People wake, work, cook, pray. Markets open. Obligations are still spoken of in the future tense. But something small has already shifted. The grain is thinner than it should be. In medieval life, famine rarely arrived as a sudden collapse. It crept in quietly, disguised as inconvenience. Bread feels lighter in the hand. Meals stretch a little more than usual. The seed basket is checked twice instead of once. No one says the word famine yet. Exchange still exists, but it strains. Barter becomes awkward. A sack of grain no longer buys what it used to. People hesitate longer before agreeing. Offers are withdrawn mid-conversation. Credit extends, but with visible reluctance. Trust tightens. In good years, exchange flows easily because surplus exists somewhere. In famine years, surplus becomes rumor. Everyone assumes someone else still has more, until it becomes clear that no one does. This is when the old systems begin to fail. Seasonal payments are still expected. Tithes are still due. Rent is still owed. But the harvest does not arrive as promised. Weather turns against expectation. Too much rain, too little sun, frost at the wrong time. Nature breaks its side of the agreement. Human systems do not. Grain prices rise, even where money is not central. Barter ratios change sharply. What once cost a loaf now costs 2. Then 3. Then nothing is offered at all, only silence. People begin to hold rather than trade. Hoarding is not greed here. It is calculation. Everyone knows winter is coming, and no one knows how long hunger will last. Exchange depends on trust in the future. Famine destroys that trust. You stop asking, "Is this fair?" You start asking, "Will this keep us alive?" Markets thin out. Fewer sellers appear. Buyers linger without purchasing. Arguments break out over measures and quality. Accusations of cheating multiply. Value becomes unstable. The village memory that once governed exchange now sharpens into judgment. People remember who shares, and who does not. These memories are not gentle. They carry resentment. But sharing has limits. A family that gives too much risks becoming the next in need. So generosity becomes cautious, strategic. Help is offered in pieces, not wholes. Half loaves. Small bowls. Promises instead of food. Promises are cheaper. Institutions respond unevenly. Some lords open storehouses. Others close them. Some monasteries distribute alms carefully. Others protect reserves. The difference is remembered long after the famine ends, if it ends. These decisions shape survival. Those with power discover something uncomfortable. Scarcity reveals authority brutally. People obey less when hungry. Theft increases. Trespassing becomes common. Animals disappear at night. Law weakens when stomachs are empty. Women feel famine first and longest. They manage shrinking stores. They stretch meals. They skip portions. Children are fed before adults. Adults before elders. Choices are made quietly, repeatedly. This is invisible labor under maximum pressure. Children learn hunger as routine. Their bodies adjust poorly. Illness spreads faster. Mortality rises, not dramatically at first, but steadily. Famine is slow violence. Exchange systems unravel one by one. Barter fails because no one wants to part with essentials. Labor exchange fails because hunger weakens bodies. Credit fails because the future is uncertain. Only coercion remains. Authorities tighten demands. Debts are enforced harshly. Payment failures are punished. The logic is cruel but simple. If systems relax, control erodes. But control without food is brittle. Some people leave. Migration increases. Roads fill with the desperate. Temporary trust replaces long memory. Villages lose population. Fields go untilled. Famine feeds itself. Those who stay behind face choices that feel impossible. Eat seed grain or plant it. Slaughter animals or preserve breeding stock. Pay tithe or survive winter. Every choice sacrifices the future for the present, or the present for the future. And no one knows which will matter more. This is the moment when exchange without money reveals its limits. Systems built on memory, trust, season, and obligation cannot adapt quickly to prolonged scarcity. They were never meant to. After the hunger settles in, something fundamental changes. People stop pretending the old rules still apply. The language of exchange, owed, promised, remembered, loses its force when bodies weaken. Hunger does not respect precedent. It does not care who helped whom 5 years ago. It does not wait for harvest dates or holy days. It demands answers now. And so behavior shifts. Families begin making choices that would have been unthinkable in better years. Seed grain is eaten. Breeding animals are slaughtered. Tools are sold or traded for food, even though they will be needed later. The future is steadily dismantled to buy another day. This is not panic. It is calculation under pressure. Markets, where they still exist, transform. Prices no longer fluctuate gently, they spike and collapse unpredictably. Grain might be unavailable at any price. Or suddenly appear at extortionate terms. Barter becomes desperate. Clothing for food, heirlooms for bread, labor for meals that barely sustain the worker. Exchange narrows to essentials. People stop trading for comfort or improvement. They trade only to delay death. Social boundaries blur. Theft increases, not because morality vanishes, but because hunger redefines it. Taking food becomes easier to justify than watching children starve. Communities respond inconsistently, sometimes with punishment, sometimes with silent understanding. Law fragments. Village memory, once a stabilizing force, turns harsh. Old grievances resurface. People remember slights more sharply than kindness. Accusations fly, of hoarding, of lying about stores, of secretly profiting. Suspicion spreads faster than hunger. Those with even small reserves become targets. They hide food. They move it at night. They downplay their situation. Visibility becomes dangerous. Wealth, once displayed through cattle, full barns, generous tables, becomes liability. The logic of survival flips. Institutions struggle. Some monasteries exhaust their stores quickly, overwhelmed by demand. Others tighten distribution, issuing rations so small they feel symbolic. Lords who open their storehouses gain loyalty, but also create dependence they cannot sustain. Once reserves empty, authority collapses. Migration accelerates. Entire households abandon land they have worked for generations. They walk toward towns, monasteries, anywhere rumors suggest food might exist. Roads fill with bodies moving slowly, carrying less each day. Temporary trust replaces community. Villages empty unevenly. The young leave first. The old stay behind, unable to move. Fields go untilled. The next harvest weakens before it begins. Famine extends itself into the future. Disease follows closely. Malnutrition lowers resistance. Illness spreads through weakened populations. What hunger begins, sickness completes. Death becomes common enough to lose its shock. Burials change. Ritual shortens. Graves multiply. Memory thins. When too many die, village memory fractures. The stories that once governed exchange disappear with the people who carried them. Obligations dissolve. Debts vanish, not because they are forgiven, but because no one remains to enforce them. This is a brutal kind of reset. Those who survive emerge into a changed world. Land is available. Labor is scarce. Old hierarchies weaken. Survivors can demand better terms, sometimes. But the cost is enormous. Communities rebuilt after famine are quieter. More cautious. Less generous. People remember hunger vividly and plan to avoid it at almost any cost. Hoarding becomes normalized. Sharing becomes conditional. Trust is slower to return. Some systems adapt. Seasonal payments are renegotiated. Rents reduced. Obligations converted to fixed terms. In some regions, famine accelerates the spread of money, not because it feeds people, but because it simplifies negotiation in the aftermath. In other regions, famine hardens old systems. Control tightens. Extraction increases. The weak are pushed out permanently. There is no single outcome. But everywhere, famine leaves marks that last generations. It reshapes attitudes toward food, authority, and exchange. It teaches people that systems are fragile, and that survival sometimes requires breaking them. When the fields eventually green again, when bread returns to tables, life resumes, but not as before. People remember which rules failed them. And that memory shapes what they accept next. At first, the marks look harmless. A few lines on parchment. A name. A date tied loosely to a feast day or season. A seal pressed into wax while witnesses watch. Nothing here feeds you. Nothing here warms you. And yet, something profound has changed. The promise no longer lives in memory. It lives on paper. For centuries, exchange in medieval life depended on people remembering who owed what, who helped whom, what was promised and when. Memory was flexible. It bent under hardship. It softened over time. Written promises did none of these things. They waited. Written agreements did not appear suddenly. They crept in quietly, used first by monasteries, then lords, then merchants, and only slowly by ordinary people. At first, they recorded exceptional moments, land grants, major debts, inheritance claims. Everyday life still ran on trust. But once writing proved useful, it spread. A written promise solved a specific problem. People died. Memory died with them. Disputes followed. Writing offered continuity. A promise written down could outlive the person who made it. This seemed sensible. It was also dangerous. When you agreed to something orally, the promise belonged to a relationship. When you agreed in writing, it belonged to a system. The relationship mattered less than the document. You might explain hardship to a neighbor. You could not explain it to parchment. Written promises fixed obligation in time. They replaced, when you can, with, on this date. They replaced, as we agreed, with, as written. Flexibility narrowed. At first, this felt like fairness. Everyone knew the terms. No one could pretend to forget. Disputes became easier to settle. But clarity has a cost. Once written, a promise could not age with circumstance. A debt written during a good year remained unchanged during a bad one. Hunger did not erase ink. Illness did not smudge seals. Writing made obligation durable. This durability shifted power toward those who could write, and those who controlled the records. Literacy was rare. Interpretation rarer. Most people could not read the promises they were bound by. They relied on others to tell them what the document said. That reliance mattered. Written promises also introduced a new idea: enforceability beyond community. A dispute no longer needed village consensus. It could be taken to a court, to an authority, to someone who did not know either party personally. This broke the hold of local memory. For some, this was relief. If village reputation trapped you unfairly, writing offered escape. A contract could override gossip. A receipt could erase suspicion. For others, it was threat. Written debt followed you when you moved. It crossed villages. It survived deaths. It could be inherited. A promise made by your father might still bind you. Obligation became transferable. Merchants embraced this early. Letters of credit, IOUs, bills of exchange allowed trade across distance. Trust no longer required familiarity. It required documentation. This expanded commerce, but thinned relationships. You no longer needed to know someone well to trade with them. You needed to know whether their paper was accepted. Trust shifted from people to proof. Monasteries refined written promises carefully. They recorded loans of grain, land use, tithes owed. Repayment terms were written in neutral language, calm, formal, precise. Mercy, when offered, was added later as amendment, not assumption. Lords followed suit. Labor obligations were written. Rents fixed. Customs codified. What had once been negotiated seasonally became static. People felt this immediately. A bad harvest no longer reopened terms. The promise had already decided. Written promises also changed how people thought about time. The future became a list of obligations rather than an open field of possibility. You did not just plan around seasons, you planned around documents. You owed because it was written. This altered moral weight. Breaking a promise was no longer just disappointing, it was illegal. Sin became crime. Failure became punishable. People became more cautious about promising anything. Ironically, writing did not reduce conflict. It relocated it. Arguments shifted from memory to interpretation. What exactly did the words mean? Who witnessed the seal? Was the date correct? Documents multiplied to clarify other documents. Administration grew. Those who mastered writing gained influence far beyond their numbers. Scribes, clerks, notaries, these quiet figures shaped outcomes without lifting tools or weapons. Their work defined reality. The promise existed where they placed it. Ordinary people adapted unevenly. Some embraced writing as protection. Others feared it as trap. Many signed documents they could not read, trusting explanation and custom to protect them. Sometimes it did. Often it did not. Written promises did not replace older systems immediately. Memory, reputation, and seasonal negotiation continued alongside them. But the balance shifted. Where conflict arose, writing increasingly won. After a while, you begin to notice that people speak differently. They are more careful, more precise, more hesitant to agree. Where once a nod or a spoken word carried weight, now people ask, "Will this be written?" And that question changes everything. Because writing does not forget. At first, written promises coexist with older habits. People still negotiate verbally. They still appeal to circumstance. But when disagreement arises, the document is produced, and conversation stops. The paper speaks last. This changes power quietly but decisively. Those who understand documents gain advantage. Those who cannot read them must trust interpretation. Trust shifts upward, away from neighbors and toward institutions. And institutions rarely forget. Courts become more important. Not local gatherings, but formal spaces where documents are examined. Witnesses matter less than seals. Memory matters less than wording. A promise is no longer what people recall, it is what the page allows. You feel this change when hardship strikes. A bad harvest no longer reopens discussion automatically. You explain. You plead. You point to empty stores. The response is calm, almost sympathetic, and unchanged. The agreement stands. This phrase spreads slowly, but once it settles, it reshapes expectations. People stop expecting flexibility. They begin planning defensively. They promise less. They borrow less. They help less, because help might become obligation written down later. Generosity becomes risky. Written promises also harden social boundaries. Credit becomes selective. Only those with proven means or strong documentation receive it. The poor struggle to access help without accepting severe terms. Writing replaces trust, but only partially. It favors those already stable. Debt becomes inheritable in practice, even when law pretends otherwise. A document does not know that a person has died. It simply persists. Heirs find themselves bound by promises they never made. This creates resentment. People begin to feel that writing captures them more tightly than memory ever did. Memory could soften. It could forgive. It could forget. Writing does none of these things unless explicitly altered. Amendments require authority. So people seek authority, to change documents, to void them, to reinterpret them. Power concentrates around those who can grant such changes. Scribes gain quiet influence. So do judges, abbots, officials. They become translators between lived reality and written obligation. Translation is never neutral. Some use this power carefully. Others exploit it. Errors appear. Clauses are interpreted narrowly. Dates are enforced strictly. Mercy, once assumed, must now be argued for, and proven. The emotional distance grows. When obligation is written, failure feels colder. There is no shared shame, only consequence. Punishment replaces disappointment. Enforcement replaces persuasion. This affects how people see themselves. You are no longer primarily a member of a community. You are a party to agreements. Your identity is not what others remember, it is what documents say you owe. This abstraction spreads. Labor contracts appear. Leases formalize. Marriages involve written settlements. Life becomes surrounded by paper, even for those who cannot read it. Ironically, this creates a new kind of insecurity. If memory once trapped you unfairly, writing might free you, but only if you understand it. If you do not, writing can trap you more efficiently than gossip ever could. Fear grows quietly. People avoid signatures. They hesitate before sealing. They ask for witnesses they trust. They prefer short terms. They delay commitments. Exchange slows. Yet the system continues because it solves a different problem: scale. Villages grow. Trade expands. Memory cannot manage complexity anymore. Writing fills the gap. Efficiency replaces intimacy. And once efficiency becomes normal, it is difficult to abandon, even when it feels harsh. Written promises spread because they work. They enforce. They travel. They endure. But endurance comes at a cost. As documents multiply, forgiveness becomes procedural. Compassion must be authorized. Humanity requires approval. You know they are not from here before they say a word. Their clothes are cut differently. Their speech bends around unfamiliar sounds. They carry goods your village does not produce, salt from far coasts, cloth-dyed colors you rarely see, metal worked in unfamiliar styles. They also carry something else. Different rules. Foreign merchants arrive in medieval communities as walking disruptions. They do not belong to the village memory. They are not bound by its favors or grudges. They do not owe help because they were helped once, and they cannot expect help because no one remembers them. They exist outside the local ledger. This makes them both powerful and vulnerable. Local exchange systems, barter, seasonal payment, reputation, depend on time and familiarity. Foreign merchants bypass time. They trade now or not at all. They rely on immediate equivalence, coin, weight, written promise. This feels efficient. It also feels threatening. Villagers are wary. A merchant who leaves tomorrow cannot be pressured later. If cheated, there is no recourse. If dishonest, they are gone before memory can respond. So communities respond with rules. Markets impose restrictions on foreign sellers. They must trade only on certain days. In certain places, often through local intermediaries, prices may be fixed for them, or higher. Weights inspected closely. Goods examined repeatedly. Suspicion is institutionalized. These rules are not always hostile. They are protective. Local economies are fragile. An outsider with deep reserves or distant backing could undercut prices, drain resources, or destabilize trust-based exchange. Local rules slow that process. Foreign merchants adapt. They learn which customs to respect and which to avoid. They cultivate relationships with a few key locals, innkeepers, officials, translators, who act as bridges between systems. These intermediaries gain power quickly. They understand both sides. They know how local trust works and how merchant math works. They set terms quietly. They profit from translation. This is where exchange becomes layered. A villager trades with a local agent. The agent trades with the foreign merchant. The merchant trades onward. Each layer adds distance and cost. But it also adds safety. Foreign merchants bring coin more reliably than locals do. They carry silver, gold, letters of credit. They prefer prices over negotiation. This attracts some people, especially those tired of memory-based obligation. Money resets relationships. Pay once. Leave clean. This appeals to people on the margins, those burdened by reputation, debt, or inherited obligation. Trading with foreigners offers anonymity. A way to convert goods into value without long-term entanglement. Local authorities notice this. They worry about loss of control. If too much trade bypasses village systems, memory weakens. Obligation dissolves. Power shifts. So more rules appear. Tolls at gates. Fees for market access. Special taxes on foreign goods. Requirements to sell through approved channels. Foreign merchants are tolerated but contained. Contained but needed. Because foreign trade brings things locals cannot make. Salt preserves food. Iron improves tools. Dyes mark status. Coin lubricates large transactions. Villages and towns depend on these goods even as they resent the people who bring them. This ambivalence shapes behavior. Foreign merchants are welcomed publicly and distrusted privately. They are fed, but watched. Allowed, but restricted. Violence flares occasionally. Riots target foreign traders during scarcity. Blame travels easily toward outsiders. When bread is short, strangers are convenient explanations. Merchants learn this lesson early. They keep guards. They leave quickly. They avoid staying long enough to become targets. Temporary trust, again, governs exchange. But something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Foreign merchants introduce comparison. They compare prices across regions. They arbitrage differences. They see where grain is cheap and where it is dear. They move goods accordingly. This logic is new to many local systems. Value becomes regional, not communal. Local rules struggle to contain this shift. You cannot fully stop comparison once it exists. Villagers begin to wonder why grain costs more here than there. Why tools are cheaper 2 days' travel away. Questions spread. And with them, pressure. Foreign merchants also bring written practices. Contracts. Receipts. Bills. These documents feel cold, but they work across distance. Local traders begin adopting them to compete. Writing spreads again. Local rules adapt, but slowly. They were built for stability, not speed. Foreign merchants operate on speed. This mismatch creates tension. Some communities benefit enormously. They grow into towns, trade hubs, ports. Others are bypassed, left quieter, poorer. Geography becomes destiny. Villages and towns depend on these goods even as they resent the people who bring them. This ambivalence shapes behavior. Foreign merchants are welcomed publicly and distrusted privately. They are fed, but watched. Allowed, but restricted. Violence flares occasionally. Riots target foreign traders during scarcity. Blame travels easily toward outsiders. When bread is short, strangers are convenient explanations. Merchants learn this lesson early. They keep guards. They leave quickly. They avoid staying long enough to become targets. Temporary trust, again, governs exchange. But something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Foreign merchants introduce comparison. They compare prices across regions. They arbitrage differences. They see where grain is cheap and where it is dear. They move goods accordingly. This logic is new to many local systems. Value becomes regional, not communal. Local rules struggle to contain this shift. You cannot fully stop comparison once it exists. Villagers begin to wonder why grain costs more here than there. Why tools are cheaper 2 days' travel away. Questions spread. And with them, pressure. Foreign merchants also bring written practices. Contracts. Receipts. Bills. These documents feel cold, but they work across distance. Local traders begin adopting them to compete. Writing spreads again. Local rules adapt, but slowly. They were built for stability, not speed. Foreign merchants operate on speed. This mismatch creates tension. Some communities benefit enormously. They grow into towns, trade hubs, ports. Others are bypassed, left quieter, poorer. Geography becomes destiny. Local resentment shifts target. It is no longer the foreigner alone. It is the protected foreigner. The one who plays by written rules rather than shared custom. Riots become more organized, complaints more legal. Conflict moves from streets to courts. Paper replaces pitchforks, most of the time. Culturally, something deeper changes. People begin thinking of exchange less as relationship and more as transaction. You trade because terms align, not because memory compels you. This feels cleaner. It also feels colder. Village memory loses some authority. Local rules are still enforced, but now alongside external standards. You can appeal beyond the community. You can bypass local reputation with coin and paperwork. For some, this is liberation. For others, it is erasure. Communities that adapt thrive. Those that resist stagnate. Some villages transform into towns. Others shrink, bypassed by routes that favor speed over tradition. The presence of foreign merchants accelerates difference. And yet, even as systems integrate, tension never disappears. Trust remains partial. Rules remain layered. Foreign merchants are never fully inside. Locals are never fully in control. Exchange becomes complex. This complexity allows growth, but also fragility. When systems tangle, failure in one spreads quickly to others. A war far away disrupts trade here. A policy change in a distant city alters prices in your market. Local life is no longer local. People sense this loss of autonomy, even if they cannot articulate it. They feel more exposed, less certain, more dependent on forces they cannot see. It is small, cold, lighter than a loaf of bread. Lighter than a handful of grain. It does not smell like work. It does not show effort. It does not spoil or grow or breathe. And yet, people begin to want it more than anything else. For centuries, exchange in medieval life has been loud and visible. You could see value, grain piled in sacks, cows grazing, hands at work, bread passed from one person to another. Value was heavy. It took up space. It demanded care. Coin changes that. Coin hides value inside metal. This is its quiet power. At first, coins circulate unevenly. Towns see them more than villages. Merchants more than farmers. Lords and churches more than households. For most people, coin appears occasionally, at markets, at tax time, in moments of crisis. It does not yet replace older systems. It sits beside them. You might still pay rent in grain, but sell a little surplus for coin. You might barter labor for food, but save coins for emergencies. Coin enters life cautiously, as something useful but unfamiliar. People test it. What can it buy? Who accepts it? When does it fail? Early on, coin feels unreliable. Different coins carry different values. Some are clipped. Some debased. some foreign. You weigh them, bite them, argue over them. Money itself becomes a subject of negotiation. But even with this uncertainty, coin offers something older systems struggle to provide: portability. You can carry a year's worth of value in a small pouch. You can move without dragging wealth behind you. You can cross villages without explaining your past. Coin makes memory optional. This appeals deeply to people burdened by long obligation, those tied down by debt, reputation, inherited promises. With coin, you can settle accounts quickly, cleanly. Pay once, leave free. That freedom is intoxicating. Coin also compresses time. Barter requires alignment of needs. Coin does not. You can sell now and buy later. You can store value without feeding it, guarding it, or worrying about rot. Time bends. This bending changes behavior. People begin producing not just for use, but for sale. Surplus is no longer just extra, it is opportunity. Grain becomes commodity. Labor becomes wage. Exchange accelerates. Markets grow busier. Prices start to appear, not fixed at first, but suggested. Usually this much. Last week it cost this. Numbers creep into speech. Comparison spreads. Why does this cost more here than there? Why does labor pay differently across seasons? These questions would have been meaningless before. Now they matter. Coin also changes power relations. Lords begin preferring cash rents. It is easier to store, easier to transport, easier to spend on wars and luxury. Monasteries accept coin alongside grain. Taxes shift slowly toward money. Obligation becomes abstract. You no longer owe this cow or that sack of wheat. You owe a number. Numbers do not care how you meet them. This is where coin begins to feel harsh. A bad harvest matters less to an abstract demand. If you cannot pay, you sell something. If nothing remains, you borrow. Debt monetizes suffering. Still, many embrace the change because coin offers choice. You choose what to sell. You choose what to buy. You choose when to engage. This sense of agency is real, even if limited. Coin also weakens old hierarchies in subtle ways. Skill can now be paid directly. A good worker can earn coin and move. A poor harvest does not automatically mean starvation if you can buy food elsewhere. Mobility increases. But so does risk. When exchange depends on money, lack of money becomes fatal faster than lack of relationships. You can starve among strangers even when food exists, if you cannot pay. This is a new kind of vulnerability. Coin also thins community ties. You no longer need to rely on neighbors as much. You can buy help. You can hire labor. Obligation dissolves into transaction. This reduces friction. It also reduces care. Village memory fades in importance. Written contracts and prices replace shared understanding. Forgiveness becomes optional. People begin to think differently about fairness. Fair is no longer what we usually do. Fair becomes what the price is. Prices feel objective. They are not, but they feel that way. Coin spreads unevenly. Some regions monetize quickly. Others resist. Hybrid systems dominate for generations. Grain here, coin there. Labor today, wages tomorrow. Confusion follows. People misjudge value. They sell too cheaply. They borrow unwisely. They underestimate the permanence of debt. Coin teaches fast, and punishes mistakes efficiently. Yet despite its dangers, coin continues spreading because it solves problems nothing else can: distance, scale, anonymity. Large systems require abstraction. Coin provides it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, exchange shifts its center of gravity. Barter becomes fallback. Memory becomes secondary. Coin becomes default. And with that shift, something profound settles into everyday life. Value no longer has to be seen to be real. It can be hidden, counted, moved without explanation. That is when it starts changing everything. You no longer think of exchange as something that requires alignment between two people's needs. You think of it as something that requires only enough. Enough coins. Enough weight. Enough counted value. The face across from you matters less than the amount in your hand. This shift happens gradually. At first, people still prefer to trade with those they know. Coin is simply a tool that smooths the process. But over time, the tool begins to reshape the habit. You realize you do not need to remember favors as carefully anymore. If someone helps you, you pay them. The payment ends the obligation. There is no lingering debt of gratitude, no future claim. This feels clean. It also feels empty. Old systems depended on memory because memory enforced balance over time. Coin enforces balance immediately. Once paid, the past dissolves. That can be relief, but it also means relationships reset constantly. You are less tied. You are also less held. Labor changes fastest. Work that was once exchanged through ongoing relationships, seasonal help, household service, shared harvests, becomes paid by the day or task. Wages appear. They are small, precise, unquestioned. Time becomes money. You work until the coins are earned. When the coins stop, so does the relationship. If you fall ill, work pauses. Payment stops. There is no shared obligation to carry you through. Risk shifts downward. People begin to save coins when they can. Hoarding no longer looks antisocial, it looks sensible. A pouch of coins offers security that relationships once provided. But coin security is solitary. If you lose it, it is gone. If you are robbed, there is no community ledger to restore balance. Loss becomes personal, not shared. Debt becomes more dangerous too. In barter systems, debt was often vague and renegotiable. In coin systems, debt is exact. You owe a number. That number does not care why you cannot pay. Interest appears, sometimes openly, sometimes disguised in fees and penalties. Debt stops being moral. It becomes mathematical. People begin selling future labor to solve present shortages. Wage advances, loans, pledges. This pulls tomorrow's work into today's survival. When tomorrow arrives, it is already spent. This is how poverty becomes chronic. Institutions adapt quickly. Lords prefer coin rents because they are predictable. Churches accept money because it travels easily. States tax in coin because armies and administrations require abstract payment. Central power grows. Local systems weaken. Village memory loses authority because it cannot compete with written accounts and fixed sums. A person known to struggle is no longer protected by reputation if they cannot pay. A person known to exploit others can still function smoothly if they have coin. Moral judgment separates from economic survival. This separation is subtle but profound. You start hearing phrases that would have sounded strange before. That's just business. The price is the price. It's nothing personal. Nothing personal, this is new. Coin makes impersonality possible. Markets expand further. Trade routes lengthen. Goods circulate faster. Variety increases. Life improves materially for many people, slowly. But inequality sharpens. Those who accumulate coin gain flexibility. They can wait. They can invest. They can absorb shocks. Those who live coin to coin are exposed. A single failure, a lost job, a bad harvest, pushes them toward debt quickly. There is less buffering. In barter systems, community absorbed some risk. In coin systems, risk is individualized. People adapt psychologically. They begin thinking of themselves as economic units. Income, expense, balance, planning becomes numerical. This is powerful and isolating. Relationships are still formed, but they are no longer required for survival in the same way. You can live among strangers as long as you can pay. You can starve among strangers if you cannot. Community becomes optional. This optionality feels like freedom to some. To others, it feels like abandonment. Hybrid worlds persist for generations. People still barter in crisis. They still rely on memory when coin fails. Old systems do not vanish, they retreat into the background. But the center has shifted. Coin becomes the default language of exchange. Everything else becomes accent. And once coin is dominant, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. Systems build on it. Expectations align around it. People forget how to live without it. Until it fails. That is the strangest part. There is no single moment when people gather and say, "This is different now." No bell is rung. No rule announced. Life continues, markets open, coins change hands, work is done, bread is eaten. And yet, something slips away. Not taken. Not destroyed. Simply no longer required. What is lost first is not a thing you can point to. It is a habit. You stop remembering as much. In a world governed by barter, obligation, and long memory, remembering was survival. You remembered who helped you. You remembered who needed help. You remembered what you owed, not because it was written, but because forgetting was dangerous. Now, forgetting is allowed. You pay, and the obligation ends. You sell, and the relationship dissolves. You hire, and the memory resets at the end of the day. This efficiency feels like relief. But relief has a cost. Gradually, you no longer know your neighbors as deeply. You know what they charge. You know when they are open. You know whether they are affordable. You do not need to know their history. That knowledge becomes optional. And when something becomes optional, it is rarely practiced for long. What is lost next is patience. Older systems moved slowly because they had to. Barter required alignment. Seasonal payment required waiting. Obligation stretched across time. You endured discomfort knowing balance would return later. Coin collapses time. You want something now, you buy it now. You need help now, you hire it now. The future no longer mediates the present. The present consumes it. Waiting feels unnecessary. This reshapes expectations. People grow less tolerant of delay, less forgiving of hardship, less willing to renegotiate. If you can't pay, that's your problem. This sentence becomes possible only when memory is no longer required. What is lost next is shared risk. In earlier systems, risk was distributed unevenly but collectively. A bad harvest affected everyone. People adapted together. Some suffered more than others, but survival was intertwined. With money, risk becomes isolatable. If you have coin, you are insulated. If you do not, you are exposed. The community no longer absorbs shock by default. It responds selectively, often through charity rather than obligation. Help becomes optional, moral rather than structural. Charity replaces responsibility. This feels kinder in language, but weaker in practice. What is lost next is forgiveness. Not forgiveness as an idea, but forgiveness as a system. In memory-based exchange, forgiveness was necessary because enforcement was social. You had to live together afterward. Letting go of past failures kept the community functioning. In written, monetized systems, forgiveness requires permission. A clause. An authority. A decision. It becomes rare. Debts persist. Records endure. Mistakes follow people longer than circumstances justify. Redemption becomes bureaucratic. Forgiveness becomes expensive. What is lost next is the visibility of value. When wealth was grain, cattle, labor, it was seen. You knew who had much and who had little. Inequality was visible, and therefore discussed, judged, managed. With coin, wealth hides. It sits in purses, chests, accounts. You cannot see it easily. Inequality grows quietly. By the time it is noticed, it is entrenched. Envy increases. Understanding decreases. People stop knowing where others stand. What is lost next is the meaning of work. When work was exchanged through relationship, it carried recognition. People knew who built what, who helped whom, who endured hardest seasons. Now work is priced. Once paid, it disappears into the background. You are not remembered for effort, only for output. Skill becomes a line item. Pride thins. Alienation grows. This does not mean life becomes worse for everyone. For many, life becomes materially better. Variety increases. Mobility expands. Choice multiplies. But something quieter disappears alongside improvement. The sense that survival is shared. The sense that memory matters. The sense that obligation is human, not numerical. These losses do not appear on any balance sheet. They are felt instead in small ways. In how quickly doors close. In how little explanation is given. In how rarely people feel owed to one another. You gain freedom. You lose belonging. And as systems harden around abstraction, people adapt their expectations downward. They expect less help. They offer less help. They call this realism. It is. But it is also loss. Because realism does not replace connection. It only explains its absence. That is how you know it has settled. People no longer talk about how things used to work. They talk about how things are. Coins are counted without comment. Prices are accepted without argument. Work is done, paid for, and forgotten. Life continues efficiently. And yet, something in daily life feels thinner. Conversations shorten. Not because people dislike one another, but because there is less reason to linger. When exchange is immediate and complete, there is no need to explain, no need to remember, no need to plan around each other. You meet more people. You know fewer of them. In earlier systems, dependence forced familiarity. You needed neighbors. You needed memory. You needed people to know who you were when you struggled. Now, you need money. Money does not ask questions. This creates a subtle emotional shift. When help arrives through payment rather than relationship, gratitude changes shape. You are thankful, but not connected. The exchange ends cleanly. Clean endings accumulate. Over time, people stop expecting understanding. They expect terms. They stop explaining hardship because explanation no longer changes outcomes. They stop sharing stories because stories do not affect price. Silence becomes efficient. This efficiency reaches into institutions as well. Charity replaces obligation. Help is offered through structured channels rather than personal ones. Alms are given. Services provided. Forms filled. Help becomes distant. This distance protects dignity in one sense. You do not have to expose yourself to those you know. But it also removes the warmth of being seen by someone who remembers you. You are helped as a case, not a person. The long memory of the village, once heavy and inescapable, is gone. With it goes the assurance that someone will notice if you disappear slowly. Now, disappearance can be quiet. People fall through gaps not because anyone pushes them, but because no one is watching closely enough to catch them. Systems respond to thresholds, amounts owed, time unpaid, rules broken, not to gradual decline. This is a new kind of vulnerability. The past also changes shape. Stories of old exchange systems begin sounding romantic or impractical. That could never work now, people say, even when they have never lived differently. Memory becomes myth. You gain freedom from old constraints, but you also lose inherited wisdom about sharing risk, absorbing shock, and forgiving failure. Those practices were not perfect, but they were practiced. Now, when crisis hits, war, plague, economic collapse, people rediscover these old habits awkwardly. Barter returns. Neighbors help neighbors again. Memory reactivates. But it feels improvised. The skills have faded. People remember that communities once absorbed shock together, but not how they did it. The knowledge was not written down. It lived in habit. When the habit disappeared, the knowledge went with it. Loss reveals itself only in absence. What was lost was not kindness. People are still kind. What was lost was structure for kindness. A system that required people to help because survival demanded it, not because morality suggested it. Without that structure, help depends on choice. Choice is powerful, but uneven. Some choose generously. Others do not. The difference grows. This unevenness hardens into inequality that feels natural because it is no longer visible as choice. It is framed as outcome, as personal responsibility, as numbers. People begin blaming themselves for failures that older systems would have shared. Shame replaces solidarity. And yet, despite all this, people adapt. They build new forms of belonging. Associations, guilds, unions, communities of interest rather than place. These are attempts to recreate what was lost, voluntarily. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes they fracture just as easily as they form. What was lost, in the end, was not a perfect world. The old systems were harsh, limiting, and unequal in their own ways. But they made one thing unavoidable. People mattered to one another because survival required it. When survival no longer requires relationship, relationship becomes optional. Optional things fade.